Patrick.
Guten Tag. Very nice to see you.
Very
I'm
nice
very
to
happy
see
to see
you.
you.
And nice to see you, Patrick.
A guest professor at the School of Chinese Language and Literature, Beijing Normal University. His research engaged in cultural diplomacy and inter-civilizational dialogue and cultural history of Euro-Asian civilizations, and often shares his knowledge to various uh, televisions in China and international magazines as well. We are very grateful that he accepted our invitation to share some of his wisdom. I'm getting a kind of disturbance. Kindly mute all. Yes, yes, I have to mute everybody. So uh, let me give a brief introduction of our Swadhyaya Sahachkara also. Swadhyaya Sahachkara, co-learning circle of self and mutual studies, is an initiative of studying and learning self together, self, culture, and societies and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to work and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements and social cultural change in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Gandhi Chittaranjan Das, a seeker and creative thinker from Orissa, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect upon our creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share their life's vision, sadhana, and struggle for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogues. We meet every Sundays and sometimes Wednesday. We are now nurturing this in collaboration with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of Raffles University and Raise Global Foundation, USA. So far as the topic is concerned, thank you, Professor Anand Kumar Giri sir, for selecting a beautiful topic. And famously Carl Jung, from his work Hegel to Nietzsche, he said, Goethe made German literature into world literature, and Hegel made German philosophy into a world philosophy. I think philosophy has always two broad goals, which might be called truth and edification. The former goal is shared with science and mathematics. The latter goal, how to see the world through a helpful or life enhancing lens, is shared with poetry. Drawing the very insights from Rothry's work, Philosophy as Poetry, where he uh, makes us understand about the irrelevance of the contradictory pursuit between philosophy and poetry. Poetry invokes a special kind of deep thinking where we interpret ordinary links between language and world and mind as a kind of diagram of possibilities of experience. I want to recall Maya Angelou, and she said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. In the same sense, Lawrence, also in his great contribution, Poetry as Insurgent Art, and he said, poetry, the eyes of heart, the heart of the mind, it is the energy of soul, if soul exists. Now I would like to invite Professor Anand Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate the session. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Randhir. And
And sorry for the inconvenience, because I'm facing electricity problem, and weather is very bad outside in Rajasthan, so I'm facing this kind of problem. Sorry for the inconvenience.
So thank you, Randhir, and a warm welcome to all friends. Professor David Bartosch, our dear friend, who would hold our hand today. and he would also put our hands to hands of Holderlin and Goethe, and help us to sing the poem Rhine and also East West Vivad. And we are very grateful to also our dear friends, Professor Patrick Laude, who would join us in this system, Professor Asha Mukherjee and Professor John Clammer, to help us understand different dimensions of this theme, poetry, philosophy, and world literature. I wish to share some initial sharing with you. But before that, let us invite Swati, who has kindly offered also to offer us an invocation. Swati, please.
Sir, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes.
you are audible.
Okay. I'll start now. मैत्रीं भजत किल हृजयत्री मैत्रीं भजत किल हृजयत्री आत्मवदेव परानपि पश्यत आत्मवदेव परानपि पश्यत युध्यं त्यजत स्पर्धां त्यजत युद्धं त्यजत स्पर्धां त्यजत त्यजत परेषु क्रममाक्रमणम् त्यजत परेषु क्रममाक्रमणम् जननी पृथ्वी कामदुगास्ते जननी पृथ्वी कामदुगास्ते जनको देवा सकल दयालु जनको देवा सकल दयालु धाम्यत धत्त दयधुञ्झनत धाम्यत धत्त दयधुञ्झनत श्रेयो भूयात् सकल जनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकल जनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकल जनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकल जनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकल जनानां.
Thank you, Swati.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Shreya Bhuya Sakala Jana. So let all people have Shreya, that sense of well-being, that sense of excellence. And poetry, literature, and philosophy, they are co-workers in this journey. And wherever we are, they work with us and also bring us from where to our world. So with gratitude to all of you, I wish to offer this initial presentation. I would share the screen now. Poetry, philosophy, and world literature. Holderlin, Goethe, and beyond, some preliminary notes. Now, as we begin, I wish to begin with this poem from Holderlin. Once gods walked among humans, The splendid muses and youthful Apollo inspired and healed us just like you, and you are to me as if one of the holy ones had sent me forth into life, and the image of my beloved goes with me. And wherever I stay and whatever I learn, I learned and gained it from her with a love that lasts until death. And he continues this in the next set of lines. Then let us leave you with whom I suffer and inwardly strives towards better times in faith and loyalty, for we are the ones. And if people should remember us both in years to come, when spirit again prevails, they would say that these lonely ones lovingly created a secret world known to the gods alone. The earth will take back those concerned with impermanent things, others climb higher to ethereal light who have been faithful to the love inside themselves and the spirit of God. Thus they master faith in patience, hope, and witness. And then our dear friend David had shared with us that he would discuss Holderlin's poem, The Rhine. And Martin Heidegger, who also meditated with Holderlin's poetry, is saying the hydroelectric plant is not built into the river, Rhine River, as was the old wooden bridge that joined bank with bank for hundreds of years. Rather, the river is dammed up to the power plant. But the river is now namely a water power supplier derives from the essence of the power station. Let us ponder for a moment the contrast that is spoken by the two titles, the Rhine as dammed up into power works and the Rhine as uttered by the artwork in Holderlin's Heim by that name. Heidegger himself wrote about poetry, and he said, poetry is not merely an ornament accompanying existence, not merely a temporary enthusiasm or nothing but an interest and amusement. Poetry is the foundation which supports history. And he goes on to say that poetry never takes language as a raw material ready to hand, rather it is poetry which makes the language possible. And therefore, if we are talking about world literature, that how we also have to cultivate a path, as Heidegger says, language is a way-making path. So what kind of transformations it requires so that our languages of the world, literatures of the world become world literature. Speaking about the relationship between poetry and philosophy, we also have very deep reflections from Charles Taylor, who also reflected on the work of another great German poet named Celan. And in his essay, Celan and the Recovery of Language, Charles Taylor said, poetry can be seen as an event with performative force. Words which open up contact make something manifest for the first time. But what is this event? Outside of the most subjectivist interpretation, it has an objective side. Something language transcendent is manifest. For example, Taylor has more to say, but let me move on. And coming to Goethe, and in fact, the idea of world literature, in some sense, though before Goethe that was being talked about, Goethe famously stated in letters to Johann Eckermann, his colleague in 1827, national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. So the invitation and the challenge that Goethe has offered to us 1827, and it is almost 200 years now, that how we take part to hasten the approach of world literature. And in his own way, Goethe tried. For example, how he translated, Hafiz poetry, and this paragraph makes a detailed reference to Goethe's work in world literature. But for example, he not only translated Persian poetry, but also he read Sanskrit sources, Sakuntala. To Goethe, Kalidas's play Sakuntala held the world itself in a nutshell and was seminal for literatures abroad. Would you grasp the earth and heaven itself in one sole name? I name you, O Sakuntala, and everything is said. So, and from Goethe we come to Tagore, for example, and we have Professor Asha Mukherjee with us who would help us in this journey. And our dear friend Professor Makarand Paranjape also has written an essay on Tagore and world literature, building on Tagore's essay in Bangla called Vishwa Sahitya. And Makarand writes here, what Tagore meant by the world literature was the essential unity of human experience and therefore of human creativity. But more than that, it signified to him the ever-evolving, never complete edifice of the best and the most authentic expression of human creativity, fashioned by so many hands, spread in so many parts of the world, but still part of one narrative of human race. And when we come to Tagore's journey with world literature, for example, his meeting with many seekers and creative writers from around the world, and not only from the literary domain, like his famous meeting with Albert Einstein, his journey to Argentina, and his meeting with Victoria Ocampo. And I was reading Victoria Ocampo's, reflection of the experience of Tagore, Tagore staying with Victoria Ocampo, and that love, that deep sense of respect to each other. Therefore, world literature is not just an impersonal thing. It is a journey of travel, love, and translation. To this, we also can invite some recent interesting work. For example, Professor David Damrosch from Harvard University. He has been working in the field of world literature. He has a book called World Literature in Theory. And these are some of the thoughts on his work. World literature happens when Russian novels remake English literature, when a Turkish writer takes inspiration from a Colombian writer, when Japanese critics review translations of Lebanese poetry. It almost always involves reinterpretation and misunderstanding. A Spanish monk sent to suppress Aztec literature ended up disseminating it instead. Subsequently, Aztec hymns envision a Christian god urging revolt against the Spaniards. While literature is also nothing new under the sun, Damrosch's first book, Narrative Covenant, is about the influence of a range of Mesopotamian literatures from the first millennium BC on the composition of much of the Bible, for example. And how the field of world literature is also, inspired by the work of Casanova's The World Republic of Letters and Franco Moretti's conjectures on world literature. And Damrosch is saying that world literature is not just an elite phenomenon. He's saying that even in the learning space, much of the impulse is coming not only from the graduate schools, but from community colleges, like in the USA, when people from different backgrounds are meeting. So that kind of a grassroots dimensions of world literature is that wherever we are, we can contribute to world literature. And here, I also want to bring the work of Chittaranjan Das from Odisha, and how from the very early stage of his life, he has translated important works. For example, the Russian novelist Dr. Zhivago, and he might have translated around 60, 70 books, from different. So that's how translation and creative dialogue is part of world literature. And then the whole idea of a world philosophy, which has implication for world literature. Professor J.N. Mohanty, the great philosopher, who is bringing so many streams of world thought together, he writes, "My tradition is constituted not by Shruti alone, but by all those texts with which I think, Plato, Kant, Hegel, to name a few. My tradition as an Indian philosopher needs then to be represented as a series of concentric circles, opening out to many other traditions, to the large conversation of mankind at the outermost fringes. This picture rehabilitates my self-understanding as being both an Indian philosopher and an universal thinker." And I think that journey of self-understanding of each one of us, simultaneously, not only an Indian philosopher, an Odishan philosopher, a Kyoto philosopher, for example, wherever we are, a Beijing philosopher, or, and at the same time, world literature and world philosopher. So with this theory, so I invite David to kindly help us. And the whole journey of our conversation is that we are grateful to David for helping us for around 30 to 35 minutes. And then our friends would join us with 10 minutes of their contributions. And then we would have thoughts from all of us co-present. So David, please. David?
Can
Hello, David. We cannot hear you properly. Who is bringing so many streams of world thought together? He writes, "My tradition is constituted not by Shruti alone, but by all those texts with which I think, Plato, Kant, Hegel, to name a few. My tradition as an Indian philosopher needs then to be represented as a series of concentric circles, opening out to many other traditions, to the large conversation of mankind at the outermost fringes. This picture rehabilitates my self-understanding as being both an Indian philosopher and an universal thinker." And I think that journey of self-understanding of each one of us, simultaneously, not only an Indian philosopher, an Odishan philosopher, a Kyoto philosopher, for example, wherever we are, a Beijing philosopher, or, and at the same time, world literature and world philosopher. So with this theory, So I invite David to kindly help us. And the whole journey of our conversation is that we are grateful to David for helping us for around 30 to 35 minutes. And then our friends would join us with 10 minutes of their contributions. And then we would have thoughts from all of us co-present. So David, please. David?
Okay.
Hello, David. We cannot hear you properly.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, you are audible.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So let's start. Let's start. Let's hope it works. Otherwise, I might use my mobile phone connection or something like that. Maybe my university net is too slow. I'm not sure what the problem is. Okay, let me start with the lecture until it holds, so as long as it holds. So first of all, thank you again for this invitation. I'm very honored to be invited to this circle, learning circle. Also, I'm very honored to talk here in this context of a civilization, a very ancient civilization, which belongs to the founding civilizations of world philosophy. Of course, always in this context, the philosopher Udalaka comes to mind as one of the earliest known thinkers of mankind. And today, Ananta proposed, or he very friendly shifted me into the direction to talk about the topic of poetry, philosophy, and world literature. Goethe, Holderlin, and beyond. And so I decided to take a try and to engage in, as Ananta calls that, usually footwork through that rather vast landscape and possibilities of thinking through this topic. I'm pretty sure we also will have a lot of opportunities to discuss the matter after my short presentation. So let me just provide you with the abstract for today's little talk here from me. Today's talk will be developed by passing through the region which connects poetry and philosophy. This path of thinking is intended to lead towards the horizon of the term world literature. Respectively, the derived notions of world poetry and world philosophy in this context. Altogether, I intend to critically turn to some fundamental thoughts of Goethe and Heidegger along this way. An example from Hölderlin's poetry, the first verse of his famous poem Der Rhein, in English, The Rhine, will become the starting point for transcultural comparative prospections that will provide further hints at the future, possible future horizon of world philosophy and world poetry. So let me start. What might be the relationship between poetry and philosophy? What is their difference? And what is their point of convergence? I'm going to follow these questions in view and perspective of the term world literature. The subtitle of my speech is Goethe, Holderlin, and Beyond. In the end, we will find out what the term beyond is supposed to mean here from a philosophical angle. Part 1. Languages as houses of being. You may ask why I start with two philosophically minded German poets, Goethe and Holderlin here. Two great poets of the times of Kant and Hegel, so in the 50 years from 1780 to 1830. At first, it has to be emphasized here that every civilization and region has brought forth great poets, which have become part of world literature. Interestingly enough, many of these figures have influenced each other way beyond the borders of their regions, civilizations, and times. In this sense, also other poets could have taken the place of Goethe and Holderlin in the subtitle of this lecture. One example that comes to mind at the moment is the Farsi-speaking Azeri poet Nizami Ganjavi, who lived in the region of today's Azerbaijan and whose 880th birthday we celebrate this year. William Shakespeare considered Nizami his spiritual mentor. The Farsi-speaking poet has influenced the German playwrights Schiller and Goethe, and the Italian composer Puccini. Likewise, he has influenced the poetry of Central Asian peoples, and his stories have deeply influenced the art history of India, especially during the Mughal era. Likewise, poets of all civilizations have founded transcultural networks of poetic imagery across borders and times. The reason why I chose, or maybe also why Professor Giri has chosen and proposed to choose Goethe and Holderlin is, on one hand, because German is my mother language as well. In comparative endeavors, while reaching out for comprehensive perspectives, we have to start somewhere. It is natural to start our travels from places we call home. This can be a region, a complex of traditions, a worldview which is closest to us in terms of prior socialization, etc. I have always been in touch with Goethe, living close by his most important creative site as a child, visiting his garden house in Weimar, a little small town in the center of Germany. I have walked the philosopher's path in view of the beautiful German university city of Heidelberg, a walkway not only favored by Holderlin himself at the time, but by many others like Hegel, etc. as well, when they were in the city. I think it helps to connect those historical figures that we are considering in our academic writing with our life worlds and our actual experiences. For example, if one wants to understand Chinese philosophy traditions from a comparative angle, it is best to also live in China, to also gain impressions of the past and present aspects of the life world, which is expressing these foundations of the respective civilization and its cultures in the plural. In his letter on humanism, Martin Heidegger said, I'm quoting the German first, and then I will provide you with the translation.
Dear David,
yes,
I have a request to you and all friends co-present. So if possible, I would take 5 minutes to translate what you have said.
Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry, I forgot. Yeah. Of course.
And I seek the kindness of all participants that our Sahachkara dialogue, has many friends from Odisha who would benefit from a little bit of translation in Odia.
Of course.
So I seek your generosity. And so amar bhai bhauni mane ajikar jo alochana tar shirsaka hochi kavita sahitya darsana ଏବଂ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟର ଯେଉଁ କଥାଟି ଆମେ ପକାଉଛୁ ଏବଂ ସେଇଥିରେ ମୁଁ ପ୍ରାରମ୍ଭିକ କଥାଟି ପକେଇଥିଲି ଯେମିତି ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟର କଥା ଆଜି ଆମେ ଦୁଇ ଜଣ ଜର୍ମାନ କବି ହୋଲ୍ଡରଲିନ୍ ଏବଂ ଗୁଏଟେ ତାଙ୍କ ବିଷୟରେ ଆଲୋଚନା କରୁଛୁ। ହୋଲ୍ଡରଲିନ୍ଙ୍କର ଗୋଟେ ବହୁତ ବଡ଼ କବିତାଟିଏ ଯେତେବେଳେ ମାନେ ଦେବତା ମାନେ ପୃଥିବୀରେ ଚାଲୁଥିଲେ। ଗୁଏଟେ ସେମିତି ଭାରି ମହାନ ଜର୍ମାନ କବି ଏବଂ ସିଏ ପାର୍ସିଆନ ଭାଷାରେ ହଫିଜ୍ ତାଙ୍କୁ ସିଏ ଜର୍ମାନକୁ ଟ୍ରାନ୍ସଲେଟ୍ କରିଛନ୍ତି ଏବଂ ଏଇ ସବୁ ସହିତ ଆମର ବନ୍ଧୁ ଡାଭିଡ୍ ଆଜି କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଯେ ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟର କଥାଟି ସେଇଟା ଆରମ୍ଭ ହେଉଛି ଆମେ ଯେଉଁଠି ଅଛୁ ଏବଂ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଜଣେ ନିଜାମୀ ଗଞ୍ଜାଭି ବୋଲି ଜଣେ ଆଜରବାଇଜାନର ଜଣେ ମହାନ କବି ଥିଲେ ତାଙ୍କର 880 ବର୍ଷ ଏବେ ପାଳନ କରାଯାଉଛି ଯିଏ ସେକ୍ସପିୟରଙ୍କୁ ଅନୁପ୍ରାଣିତ କରିଥିଲେ। ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ ସେକ୍ସପିୟରଙ୍କ ନାମ ଶୁଣିଛୁ କିଛି ଶୁଣିଛୁ କିନ୍ତୁ ଗଞ୍ଜାଭୀଙ୍କ ନାମ କିଏ ଶୁଣିଛନ୍ତି? ତେଣୁ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟର ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ଧାରାଟି ଆମ ଯେଉଁଠି ଆମେ ରହୁଛୁ ଆମ ଭିତରୁ ହିଁ କବି ଏବଂ ସାହିତ୍ୟିକ ମାନେ ଜନ୍ମ ନେଉଛନ୍ତି ଏବଂ ସେମାନଙ୍କର ଏକ ବିଶ୍ୱସ୍ତରୀୟ ପ୍ରଭାବ ରହିଛି ବା ସମ୍ଭାବନାଟି ରହିଛି। ତେଣୁ ଗୋଟେ ଟ୍ରାନ୍ସ କଲଚରାଲ ନେଟୱାର୍କଟି କାମ କରୁଛି। ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ କଥାଟି ସେ କହିଲେ ଯେ ଆମର ବନ୍ଧୁ ଡାଭିଡ୍ ଯେହେତୁ ସେ ଜର୍ମାନୀରେ ଜନ୍ମଗ୍ରହଣ କରିଛନ୍ତି ଜର୍ମାନ ଭାଷା ଜାଣିଛନ୍ତି ଗୁଏଟେ ଯେଉଁଠି ରହୁଥିଲେ ୱାଇମାର ସେ ତାଙ୍କର ଗୁଏଟେର ଗାର୍ଡେନକୁ ଯାଇଛନ୍ତି। ତେଣୁ ତାଙ୍କ ପକ୍ଷରେ ଯେ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟ କଥା କହିଲା ବେଳେ ହୋଲ୍ଡରଲିନ୍ ଏବଂ ଗୁଏଟେଙ୍କ ହାତ ଧରି ସେ ଚାଇନାକୁ ଆସିଛନ୍ତି ଚାଇନାରେ ରହିଛନ୍ତି ଏବେ ଚାଇନିଜ ସଂସ୍କୃତିକୁ ବୁଝୁଛନ୍ତି। ତେଣୁ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟ ଏବଂ ବିଶ୍ୱ ଦର୍ଶନ ପାଇଁ ଏଇଟା ଆମ ଆଗରେ ଗୋଟେ ଆହ୍ୱାନ। ଆମେ ଏମିତି ପୃଥିବୀର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଜାଗାକୁ ଯିବା ସେଠାକାର କବି ସେଠାକାର ଜୀବନ ସହିତ ମିଶିବା ଲାଇଫ୍ ୱାର୍ଲ୍ଡ ଜୀବନ ଜଗତ ସହିତ ମିଶିବା। ତେଣୁ ଆମର ଉପସ୍ଥିତ ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀ ମାନେ ଏମିତି ଆଜିର ଆଲୋଚନାଟାକୁ ମୁଁ ସଂକ୍ଷେପରେ ଏମିତି କିଛି କହିବି ଏବଂ ଆପଣମାନଙ୍କୁ ଅନୁରୋଧ କରିବି ଆପଣମାନେ ଯଥାସମ୍ଭବ ବୁଝିବାକୁ ଚେଷ୍ଟା କରିବେ ନୋଟ୍ସ ଦେବେ ପୁଣି ପରେ କଥାବାର୍ତ୍ତା କରିବା। So now dear David please.
Thank you for this great translation. I know it's very hard to translate to compress these thoughts and then to translate into another language. So I'm always very impressed when you do that. Okay, let me continue. In his letter on humanism, Martin Heidegger said, and I'm quoting the German original first, and then I will translate into English. Die Sprache ist das Haus des Seins. In ihrer Behausung wohnt der Mensch. Die Denkenden und Dichtenden sind die Wächter dieser Behausung. In English, language is the house of being. Man is dwelling in her housing. the thinkers and poets are the guardians of this housing. Heidegger emphasized the importance of our mother languages in the transferred philosophical sense of being at home, or the being at home. When we reach out for the comprehensive horizons of world poetry or world philosophy, to acquire new horizons and elements of the world's traditions, we also have to reflect where we come from. So therefore, on the one hand, it is important to start with and also to always get back to those masters of the poetry of our mother language and to the places we might feel connected to in terms of our upbringing and original socialization. But how do we get to know our particular house of being, our mother tongue, ourselves in the world? We will not be able to appreciate it to the fullest if we just stay inside the house, so to speak. We have to have a look at it from the outside and in perspective and in comparison with other houses, the mother tongues of others, and the cultural refinement that takes place in these other houses of being. We might even have to get to know other houses of Sein, being, or in South Asian perspective, Sat, or in East Asian view, Tao, etc., from the inside as well, to be able to compare and to differentiate. In this sense, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was right when he said that we would not be able to properly reflect upon our own language without making at least one foreign language our own as well. The great German linguists of the 19th century, like Wilhelm von Humboldt or later Georg von der Gabelentz, for example, and many, many others, have extended this task provided by Goethe to the academic mastery of a plurality of very different languages. It might be added that vice versa, to make another language horizon our extended house of being, we should not abandon our original, and we cannot abandon our original house, of course. On the contrary, we have to be able to orient ourselves quite well in it, to orient ourselves in the added living space of other languages and their poetry as well as philosophies. In this sense, it is also right when the poet-philosopher Friedrich Holderlin, in a letter to his friend Casimir Ulrich Böllendorf from December 4th, 1801, once said in German, "Das eigene will so gut gelernt sein wie das Fremde." In English, one's own needs to be studied as thoroughly or sufficiently as the foreign or the unknown. End quote. And maybe at one point, we even have to step outside the city walls to enhance the metaphor here, to look at all houses from an outside perspective. The world perspective is supposed to allude to the fact that such a look is still a finite perspective, of course, a personal view, of course. We will always look at things from a certain angle, our angle, but we can extend the scope of our comparative understanding from this angle as well, to gain our own personal overview effect on the city of humanity and all its houses of being. That's the point here. I'm reusing a metaphor by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 17th century German philosopher here, in a transferred sense hereby, of course. So I will now arrive at a part 2 of my speech. So Ananta, maybe you would like to translate until until
Yes.
here. Maybe it's
Yes, yes, yes. So thank you, David. ଏବଂ ଆମର ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀ ମାନେ ଆଉ ଏ ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ଦାବିଡ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଆମକୁ ଜର୍ମାନ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ହାଇଡିଗରଙ୍କ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ, ମାର୍ଟିନ ହାଇଡିଗର, ଯିଏ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଆମର ଯୋଉ ଭାଷାଟା, ସେଇ ଭାଷାଟା ହଉଛି ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ହାଉସ୍ ଅଫ୍ ବିଙ୍ଗ, ଆମର ଗୋଟେ ସତ୍ତାର ଘରଟିଏ। ଏବଂ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଭାଷାଟି ଆମର ରହିଛି, ସେ ଭାଷାର ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗାର୍ଡିଆନ କିଏ, ତାର ମାଳି କିଏ? ଗାର୍ଡିଆନ ଏବଂ ଗାର୍ଡେନର, ରକ୍ଷକ ଏବଂ ମାଳି ପ୍ରକୃତରେ କବି ଆଉ ଲେଖକ ମାନେ, ଚିନ୍ତାବିତ ଆଉ କବି ମାନେ ତାର। ଏବଂ ହାଇଡିଗର ମଧ୍ୟ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଆମର ମାତୃଭାଷାରେ ହିଁ ଆମେ କେମିତି ଆମ ମାତୃଭାଷାରେ ଆମ ସତ୍ତାଟାକୁ ଆମେ ଯେମିତି ଅନୁଭବ କରୁଛୁ, ଆଉ ତାହା ସହିତ ଯେମିତି ଅନ୍ୟର ଭାଷାକୁ ବି ଆମକୁ କେମିତି ଜାଣିବାକୁ ପଡ଼ିବ। ଗୋଏଟେ ଯାହାଙ୍କ କଥା ପଢ଼ିଛି, ସେ ଗୋଏଟେ କହୁଥିଲେ ଯେ ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ଭାଷାଟିଏ ଜାଣିବା, ଏବଂ ଅନ୍ୟ ଭାଷାଟି ଯେପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଆମେ ନ ଜାଣିଛୁ, ଆମ ନିଜର ମାତୃଭାଷାକୁ ଭଲ ଭାବରେ ଜାଣିପାରିବା ନାହିଁ। ଜର୍ମାନୀରେ ଏଇଥିପାଇଁ ଗୋଟେ ବିରାଟ ସାଧନାର ଇତିହାସ ରହିଛି। ୱିଲହେମ ଭନ୍ ହୁମ୍ବୋଲ୍ଟ, ଯେ ଜଣେ ଭାଷାବିତ, ଗଭୀର ଭାଷାବିତ ଥିଲେ, ତାଙ୍କର ଭାଇ ଆଉ ଜଣେ ହୁମ୍ବୋଲ୍ଟ, ଯିଏ ସାରା ପୃଥିବୀକୁ ବୁଲିଥିଲେ। ତେଣୁ ହୁମ୍ବୋଲ୍ଟଙ୍କର ମଧ୍ୟ ସେଇ କଥାଟି ଯେ ଆମେ କେମିତି ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଭାଷାକୁ ଶିଖିବା, ଏବଂ ହୁମ୍ବୋଲ୍ଟ ଠାରୁ ପ୍ରେରଣା ନେଇ ଯେଉଁ ପ୍ରକାର ଶିକ୍ଷା ଜର୍ମାନୀରେ ହେଲା, ହୁମ୍ବୋଲ୍ଟ ୟୁନିଭର୍ସିଟି ସ୍ଥାପିତ ହେଲା, ସେଥିରେ ଶିକ୍ଷା କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ଗୋଟେ ମୌଳିକ ଆବଶ୍ୟକତା ହେଉଛି ଯେ ଆମେ ନିଜ ଭାଷା ଜାଣିବା ସହିତ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ଦେଶର ଭାଷା କେମିତି ଜାଣିବା, ଯୋଉଟାକି ଜର୍ମାନ ଚିନ୍ତାରେ ଅନ୍ୟ ଭାଷାବିତ ମାନେ ମଧ୍ୟ ସେ କଥା କରିଛନ୍ତି। So now, please, David. Yes, David. Yes, David, please. Your network is low.
Hear me?
Very little we can hear you. Maybe you can move it to your mobile if your university network is not working. Okay, David. Now, Randhir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you see David?
I think he is connecting to his mobile phone.
Okay, I'm back. I'm back. Hello.
Yes. Sir.
Okay, sorry for the interruption. I will just go on, and now let's hope that there will be no more interruptions.
Okay,
Part 2.
no problem.
Goethe's term world literature, a critical revision. Another reason to turn to Goethe with regard to world literature is related to the history of the concept itself. The concept, as Professor Giri has already pointed out, has a German word origin and has been popularized by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in the 1820s himself. The German word is Weltliteratur. The central passage of origin for this is the conversation that Goethe had with his friend Eckermann on January 31st, 1827. Professor Giri had already quoted it, so I will just read it again because it's so important. Goethe said, I see more and more that poetry is a common good of mankind. National literature does not want to say much now. An epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must now work to accelerate this epoch. In the need for something exemplary, we must always, then he said, we must always go back to the ancient Greeks, in whose works the beautiful human being is always depicted. All the rest, we must only look at historically and adapt the best as best we can from it, end quote. We can already recognize some central aspects in this statement, but also some assumptions that are worthy of criticism, which we perhaps need to bring to our attention anew today. As a child of his time and as a poet and playwright, Goethe somehow stands in line with his contemporaries Beethoven in music and Hegel in philosophy. They as well were striving for a world-inclusive perspective, a trans-civilizational humanism which was supposed to bring the peoples of the earth together. Yet at the same time, they were also a little bit one-sidedly influenced by the classicism since the last third of the 18th century and its Greek-centered enthusiasm. A famous contemporary German professor for modern German literature and theater studies, Dieter Borchmeier, has analyzed this mindset against the general problem that no other people in the world have struggled so much for their own identity as the Germans have and are still doing. In his recently published 1,000 pages volume, Was ist Deutsch? What is German? Borchmeier has shown that the lack of clearly defined borders, the fragmentation into countless small feudal states competing with each other culturally, but also violently, the religious and social differences between Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish German speakers, the latter mostly being treated as outcasts for many centuries, as well as many other aspects, had created a situation where German thinkers, poets, and artists started to identify themselves not as a politically or religiously or economically or otherwise socially unified nation, but as a culture nation based on a shared, cultivated literary language, arts, music, philosophy, etc. As due to the lack of a defined unified nation state, like for example in the case of France, there haven't been any clearly defined borders of what German should mean. And as culture and especially poetry are of a more inclusive, civilization connecting nature than the other way around, Goethe and others were trying to fuse the search for a German cultural identity with a general global humanism, and understanding that we have to reach hands throughout civilizations and traditions. This understanding became only more acute after the Napoleonic invasion and the related end of the Holy Roman Empire, a giant patchwork carpet of countless German-speaking feudal lands in 1806. Not only Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, also many later developments were born in the vicinity of the sound of the gunfire of Jena in that year. Originating in the aftermath of this context, the original idea of world literature didn't mean that the idea of national literature was totally abandoned, as Goethe claimed. Weltliteratur, according to these seekers like Goethe, then in 1827, was still supposed to be grounded in German language-based culture from their own angle, of course. And this, as Goethe himself has pointed out, was in turn supposed to be rooted in ancient Greek and especially Athenian classicism. So Goethe wanted to revive the Greek foundations in a new and timely German form, as well as include other elements of poetic cultures as far as Western, Central, and East Asia. A tree of poetic wisdom with claimed Greek topical roots, a German language stem, and a Eurasian tree crown of inspirations and historical influences from all over the world. A system of world literature carried by artists and scholars who would enculture the world into the German culture nation, as well as send its messages back into the world. Of course, the alleged systematic foundation of Greek classicism was not consistent, especially when one considers how Goethe, for example, idolized the 14th century Iranian poet and mystic Hafiz. The latter, after all, was not part of the ancient Greek tradition, but of the ancient Iranian one. Across cultural and historical boundaries, Goethe referred to Hafiz as his only spiritual brother. Goethe's last great poetic work, the East-West Divan, which is also influenced by many other great Eastern poets, bears further witness to this. Here, and also in his Chinese-German Hours and Seasons, Chinesische Deutsche Tages- und Jahreszeiten from 1827, he has also been inspired by what he could grasp of the Chinese poetry tradition during his day. So what also, according to Dieter Borchmeier, happened here in general was that the open and world-embracing gesture was at least implicitly mixed with a striving for a German language-based national self-identity on the too narrow foundations of cultural Hellenophilia. The alleged exclusive systematic foundation of Greek aesthetic origins is problematic because as soon as less bright individuals start to embrace it, while forgetting to embrace and to venerate the best cultural practices in all other civilizations continuously, like Goethe continuously did, of course, this might easily turn into chauvinism. And in combination with racism and not only intellectual forms of apartheid, from there to evil. And it did, as the German history from 1933 to 1945 has shown. So this is the part 2. Professor Giri, maybe you could translate or summarize a little bit, and then I will continue with part 3.
So बंधु माने आमरो बंधु डाविड कहउछंती गोएथे जो काम करथिले तांग संगरे विधोबेन एवं हिगन सेही समय विधोबेन गभीर संगीतज्ञ हिगन गभीर दार्शनिक एवं गोएथे जो कहले जे वर्ल्ड लिटरेचर से विश्व साहित्यटा प्रकृत रे तार चेरटी रहिबो जर्मन जर्मन गुटे देश जमिति भारत वर्ष सहित तार किसी सामंजस्य रही जर्मन मूलरू ही गोटे माने केंद्र जर्मन स्टेट एमती किसी नथिला बहुत समय पर्यंत प्राय 1870 पर्यंत जर्मन रो विभिन्न सब प्रदेश माने राज्य माने से माने प्राय स्वतंत्र थे एवं ताकि जोटा बांधी रखुतला सेटा होची जर्मन भाषा एई क्षेत्र रे गोएथे जतेबेले आसिले गोएथे एवं तांकर अनेक सहधर्मी माने सेमाने जो जर्मन अस्तित्व कथा भाबिले से अस्तित्वर मूलरे थिला जो ग्रीक क्लासिसिज्म जो ग्रीक माने पाश्चात्य सभ्यतार मूलरे जो ग्रीक संस्कृति रही किंतु गोएथे ता संगे कौन कले से जतेबेले ईरान रो जो कवि हाफिज तांकु जतेबेले पढ़िले तांकु कहले से होचंती मोर स्पिरिचुअल ब्रदर तेनु गोएथेंकर तांकर जर्मनी एवं तांकर निजर अवधारणा रे केवल ग्रीक इन्फ्लुएंस रहिला नाही ईरान रो इन्फ्लुएंस मध्य रहिला से भारतीय ସଂସ୍କୃତ କାବ୍ୟ ପଢିଲେ ସଂସ୍କୃତ କାବ୍ୟ ପଢିଲେ ତେଣୁ ଏମିତି କଥା ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି. So now, dear David.
Okay, part 3, a new metaphor. World literature is not one tree, but a forest. Taking the above said into consideration and speaking from a current perspective on world literature, respectively world poetry, we might better be thinking in terms of the metaphor of a living forest instead of a single tree of world literature today. Every great and distinguishable poetic culture can be thought of as a unique tree of culture growing under particular unique and geohistorical civilizational circumstances. They all have great and unique and most genuine roots, and the Greeks are not the only standard, of course. This also became clear in German discourses shortly after Goethe's remarks, when linguists like the brothers Schlegel, Friedrich Rückert, and many others in German-speaking lands and non-German nations, of course, all over Europe, started to lay open and introduce the beauty of ancient Indian epic poetry and also Iranian poetry. In the first third of the 20th century, the translation of ancient Chinese texts, for example, by Richard Wilhelm, and then others added a new Chinese horizon to the growing picture of world literature also on the German side. In this regard, Martin Heidegger, under the heading The Workings of Poetry in the Dasein of Peoples, in the existence of peoples, I don't know how to translate Dasein properly here, has already referred to a passage in Friedrich Holderlin's works, where in Aphorism 9, Holderlin says, poets have usually arisen at the beginning or end of a world period. With song, peoples rise from the heaven of their childhood into active life, into the land of culture. With song, they return from there to their original life. Art is the transition from nature to education and from education to nature, or we might also say, or we translate education as self-formation, Bildung, the German word is Bildung. Art is the transition from nature to self-formation and from self-formation to nature. We can see now that all those age-old poetic cultures grow. That is, they cultivate their particular language stems, representing their respective historical language bases, and they all grow tree crowns, which represent the fruits of mutual intercultural exchange of excellent poetry. There is, I'm still metaphorically speaking here, of course, a powerful gene drift going on in the form of translations and adaptations of poetic imagination amongst those living trees of linguistic cultivation, so to speak. Poetry, of course, also lives up and is transferred like the pollen of blooming trees by the hard work of serious translators. And to stay with this metaphor of the forest, we in fact know today, and as has been recently shown by the Canadian biologist Suzanne Simard, that all trees in a forest actually interact and share nutrients and information through the ground and by air. The roots of trees are connected with fungi underground. They use this symbiosis and network to make the whole community of life, which a forest actually represents, one network and one life. I think this provides a good metaphor to think about world literature, world poetry, and world philosophy today as well. Today, we know that all the ancient civilizations in the East, West, South, and the North have brought forth absolutely great traditions of poetry in a deep symbiosis across civilizations. One example from ancient India, besides the epic poetry of the Hindu classic that comes to mind here, might be the King Hala's Gahakosa, Book of Songs, an important compilation of poems dating from 200 BCE to 200 CE. And with regard to Goethe, Iris Henningfeld, in her article Goethe's Indian Inspirations, has reminded us of the following, quote, several poetical works and numerous autobiographical passages in Goethe's journals for the day and year, Tag und Jahreshefte from 1819 to 1825, diaries and correspondence, especially in the years when he wrote the East-West Divan, indicate his fascination with classical Indian poetry. In 1797, he wrote the ballad The God and the Bayadere, an Indian legend. Der Gott und die Bayadere, indische Legende. In Notes and Essays for a better understanding of the West-Eastern Divan, Noten und Abhandlungen zum besseren Verständnis des westöstlichen Divans, Goethe devotes numerous passages to Indian literature. In his poem Paria's Prayer of Thanks, des Paria-Gebet, 1824, which consists of a prayer by a paria to Brahma, the telling of a legend, and finally a prayer of thanksgiving, Goethe creates a symbol of mediation between the human and the divine and its inherent grace, end quote. At this point, the metaphor of interacting trees of poetic wisdom also leads us to the word world in world literature. It leads us back to the respective words in German, Welt and Weltliteratur. Many German poets and philosophers of the time, including Goethe and Holderlin, had a knack for hiking in the forests. They were always keen to dive into the cosmic network of the surrounding nature, to interact with the life in the forest while walking through, to breathe the forest, to become one with it, to carry this oneness back into the cities and to express it in the forms of their music, their art and philosophies, of course, to immerse the city life in the color of universal nature as represented by the forest. The philosopher Martin Heidegger might have been the last representative of this tradition. He sometimes walked the 36 kilometers from his university office in Freiburg to his hidden hut in the Black Forest merely by feet through the deep forest. In German, the words for world, Welt, and for forest, Wald, are deeply connected. They seem to share the same etymology. The world is a network of life, like a natural forest is. World in German, Welt, and Wald in English forest almost sound the same. Welt, Wald. The world is that what happens itself, so to speak, expressing itself as self-organizing networks of cosmic life, infinitely and way beyond our grasp. Even Kant, who did not show off as a poet, went hiking every day. And before, respectively after him, the composers Bach and Beethoven were famous for their extended footwork in natural settings. Friedrich Nietzsche was a keen forest walker, of course. Beethoven's inspirations were the forests and fields outside of the city. Here's where he found his peace all the time. And in this context, not just the German word for forest, but also the related one for English field is in the scope of our discussion. Our word for field is Feld. In my opinion, it is etymologically related to Welt, world as well. Feld, Welt, Wald, field, world, forest. In German, these words all share the same origin, it seems. Their pronunciation is exceedingly related. The fields are where humans connect, share their work, raise their crops to sustain life collectively and in indirect correlation with the cosmic natural surroundings. The dark forests with their age-old mother trees represent the deep connection to the wisdom beyond. Okay, this is part 3, and then I have a last part. Maybe Professor Giri, maybe you can translate up until here.
Very briefly, ଆମର ବନ୍ଧୁମାନେ ଆଉ ଏବେ ଯୋଉ କଥା କହିଲେ ଯେ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟର ଯୋଉ କଥାଟି ସେଟା କେବଳ ଗୋଟେ ବୃକ୍ଷ ନୁହଁ, ଏଟା ଗୋଟେ ବନ ଏବଂ ଯେମିତି ବନ ଭିତରେ ଥିବା ସବୁ ଗଛମାନଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ଏବେ ବାୟୋଲୋଜି କହୁଛି ଯେ ସେମାନଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ଗୋଟେ ସଂଳାପ ଚାଲିଛି, ତାର ଯୋଉ ରୁଟ୍ସ ମାନ ଚେରମାନ ସହିତ ପରସ୍ପର ସହିତ କଥା ହଉଛନ୍ତି, ठीक सेमती जो विश्व साहित्य रे जेते सब वृक्ष मान रही भारतीय साहित्य अमेरिकीय साहित्य तार चेर मान परस्पर संगे संश्लिष्ट तेणु ये गोटे आइडिया ऑफ द लिविंग फॉरेस्ट आउ हाइडिगर जो कवि सी बाट चलुले जो पढ़ाऊे यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ फाइबर्ग जो छोट कुड़ियाटे सिक्रेट हट गोटे गुप्त कुड़िया बोली बंधु दाविड कहते 36 किलोमीटर से चलुले ठीक सेमती सब जर्मन दार्शनिक माने विधवेन से जड़े बड़ संगीतज्ञ थे से भी बाट चलुले फरेस्ट को जाऊे आउ ता संगे अन्य माने मध्य एवं आउ गोटे कथाटी से कहते जर्मन रे जो वर्ल्ड जो बेल्ट आउ फॉरेस्ट जो वर्ड वाल्ड WALD एंड WELT तार एटिमोलॉजी प्राय से हाँ आउ ठीक सेमती आम ओडिया रे बा संस्कृत रे विश्व वर्ल्ड एंड वन विश्व एवं वन तेणु एटिमोलॉजी को गले जो प्रकृत रे जो पृथ्वीटा गोटे लिविंग फॉरेस्ट भर गोटे जीवंत नेटवर्क मान चली सेटा केमती अनुभव करने पड़ो एवं निजे आम चलिले पादरे चलिले आम से अनुभव कर नाउ David, your last section please.
Yeah, this is part 4 and then I will have a conclusion, so maybe and this is maybe the most important part now. It's building up towards Holderlin, part 4, Holderlin as a master of the wisdom beyond. In this context of an integrative perspective of the human life world and nature, also many poems by Friedrich Holderlin, 1770 to 1843, come to mind. They too have been inspired by the poet's experience of the forces of life and nature on his travels throughout landscapes yet untouched by the harbingers of industrialization. Here, one famous poem of Holderlin comes to my mind, which amongst many others also has been extensively analyzed by the philosopher Martin Heidegger. The title of the poem is Der Rhein, in English, the Rhine, the most famous German river. Let me read the first verse in German. After that, in translation, and then let me try to provide an explanation in the new sense of world poetry and world philosophy I have just been alluding to by the use of the metaphor of the world as a living forest, the all-living universe. So first in German, just enjoy. If you don't speak German, maybe you just enjoy the sound of the language. I will provide the English after that. Der Rhein von Friedrich Holderlin, first verse. Im dunklen Efeu saß ich an der Pforte des Waldes, eben da der goldene Mittag den Quell besuchend herunterkam von Treppen des Alpengebirgs, das mir die göttlich gebaute, die Burg der Himmlischen heißt, nach alter Meinung, wo aber geheim noch manches entschieden zu Menschen gelanget, von da vernahm ich ohn Vermuten ein Schicksal. Denn noch kaum war mir im warmen Schatten sich manches beredend die Seele Italia zugeschweift und fernhin an die Küsten Moreas. A proposal to render this into English from my side goes as follows. The Rhine by Friedrich Holderlin, first verse. In the dark ivy I sat at the gateway of the forest, just as the golden noon, visiting the spring, came down from the steps of the Alpine mountains, which to me the divinely built, the castle of the celestials are called, by ancient custom, from where, yet secretly determined, many a thing arrives at humans. From thence, I received without expectation a destiny, for yet barely in the warmth of shades, self-conversing on many a thing, the soul drifting towards Italia and as far as the shores of Morea. That's my English rendering of this first verse, and I just got a phone call, sorry, that's the modern that's our situation here. You want to quote Heidegger and you are disturbed by telephone calls. That's I think that's what Ananta was alluding to with, also with regard to the philosophy of technology. So I have to okay, sorry. At this point, I do not want to follow the famous interpretation and commentary of Heidegger, who strongly emphasized the actual ties to the native land of his Swabian compatriot Holderlin here. Quote, Heidegger says, "The poet looks at the Alpine mountains as the golden noon descends on them. He looks at it from south to north, from the shores of his native lake, the Swabian Sea, as Lake Constance is also called," end quote. Heidegger's realism is astonishingly shallow at this point, in my opinion. What is much more important than actual homeland references in this first verse is the general poetic philosophical symbolism of the images. The ivy is a plant that is associated with the gods, which in terms of ancient Greek but also Germanic religion are to be considered as mythical images of the principles of eternal cosmic life. The ivy is, quote Holderlin, the stuff of eternal life, German, das Zeug unsterblichen Lebens, as Holderlin says in the hymn Patmos. The golden noon is the zenith of consciousness. The golden noon is the zenith of consciousness, the highest time in the literal, but also in a transferred philosophical sense. And the golden noon represents the perfect equilibrium and harmony that the gods, the universal life principles, are striving for in the antagonism of opposing forces. The golden noon is the time and eternal moment of the highest and all-encompassing insight, meta-kairos, and self-evidence, the enlightenment of the pure golden noon coming down from the castle of the gods, which can only be grasped in the form of these poetic enigmata. It all happens for Holderlin in this moment, on this special occasion, before the soul is distracted again and is drifting again towards the south Italy or the east, Morea, the Peloponnese Peninsula. Here, the destiny and the secret of eternal life is revealing itself in the poet's reflection of the situation. Who has ears to perceive it? With Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the philosopher in Holderlin accepted the understanding that the subject-object structure of consciousness represented a primordial and existential situation. To describe it, he, as a young man, in his philosophical sketch Urteil und Sein, Judgment and Being, used the German word Urteil, which is translated into English as judgment in general. The German word Urteil, however, consists of two semantic elements which are not expressed in the English expression judgment. Urteil is consisting of Ur and Teil. The former is an ancient Indo-European prefix. It means the most ancient, most original, most foundational, the origin, the very fountain, absolute basis. The Ur in Urteil shares the same origin with the first syllables in English, origin or original, Ur, or. The second part of the word Urteil, Teil, literally means part. So the constantly judging, that is differentiating consciousness, is the representation of a most basic and original self-differentiation. However, before that in a logical, not in a temporal sense, we have to assume the infinity of being. As infinity cannot be known in terms of finite measures, it can be sensed in the experience of beauty, according to Holderlin. All of Holderlin's poems represent this one experience of infinite bliss, being in touch with the finiteness of human existence. So let me come to a conclusion, part 5, seeking a bridge from world poetry to world philosophy, a further outlook. How can we now build a bridge from world poetry to world philosophy here? Being influenced by the pantheism of his 20 years older friend Wilhelm Heinze, Holderlin understood everything as integrated, as one being, including the experiencing consciousness. The castle of the celestials, in the first verse of his poem, The Rhine, is, although it cannot be entered, not separate. It's not separate from the mortals at the feet of the eternal mountain. There is a connection, secret destiny of universal life reaching from there to here in a constant flow. So the immortals are in reach, in all encompassing insight and self-evidence of the very unity of infinite finiteness, which is maybe at best experienced in the most eloquent silence, which is represented in every word of a true philosopher poet. Holderlin understood this infinite unity as Father Ether, German Vater Äther, Father Ether, meaning the whole of the air that we breathe to the ether of the cosmos, the breath of life throughout the universe, from the cosmic space to the spaces of thinking and the spices of our sensual experiences. The gods, the principles on high, which are principles of Father Ether, to Holderlin, strive for the harmony of heaven and earth, the perfect balance and the harmony of the father and the mother aspect of the cosmos. The spring, quote, the spring coming down from the steps of the Alpine mountains represents the light and the brightness of Holderlin's Father Ether in his inseparable erotic relationship with Mother Earth in her perceived geological reality, in its importance for humanity and for dwelling and being at home in her nurturing and birth-giving realm. Father Ether and the earth are the principal forces of the universe to Holderlin, representing infinite being without beginning and without end. They are the bright and the dark, the above and the inside, that which inseminates and that which nurtures by carrying out, etc. From my perspective as a transcultural comparative philosopher, it is fascinating. It is highly fascinating that Holderlin's view is nearly identical with many elements, for example, in the pre-modern Chinese philosophical tradition. Holderlin most probably didn't know about their teachings, but somehow developed a very similar worldview, which then in turn might also help explain the close topical affinity of Heidegger's later thinking with East Asian philosophies, and maybe directly or in a sense of an implicit commonality, also the greatest interest that Chinese and Japanese admirers take in Holderlin and Heidegger. With this, I would like to come to my conclusion for today. Although not all aspects of poetry can be defined or identified as philosophy, poetic cultivation of language can become a tool of philosophy, and at least from the perspective that has been introduced here today. It relates to philosophy, but philosophical poetry makes use of symbols and images in a way that these function as semantic pointing rods towards the ineffable and the, as I have called it in my comparative work on the Chinese philosopher Wang Yangming and the German thinker Niklas of Cusa, foundational logic that every true philosophy pertains to. On the preliminary levels, the levels of those who are still searching for a deeper meaning, philosophy is based on mere concepts and the orders of conceptualities. But concepts are based on judgments and in the very end on the primordial structure of a finite consciousness, subject-object. The Urteil, as Holderlin's genius put it at a very young age, though, the very original distinction, difference itself. If this structure becomes self-evident, the aim of all philosophy, true self-reflection, can be touched upon by the mind's eye reflecting back into itself. It then sees its own principle, namely that which allows us to create precise concepts and conceptual orders, metaphorically speaking, that which draws the finite lines of the image, the self-image, perceiving itself as us, is itself without parts and distinction. It is infinite, or better, never beginning and never ending infinite self-differentiation. And it cannot, and this is the point here, it cannot be put into words by conceptualizing thinking, because all concepts are its derived, subordinated product, unable to carry and encompass their own infinite principle in finite meanings. But it can be seen in all words, uttered or written, as that which is wording each and every word, and yet will always be only gazed upon in the cosmic beauty of its primordial ineffability. In those moments, shortly before the soul drifts away again to the shores of Italia or Moria, as Holderlin has put it, from there, the true poetic moment, the cosmic network, the one infinite forest of the infinite plurality of the world trees, the unbound space of world aspects as the appearance of the infinite whole, the ancient rishis, the seers of ancient India have brought back the infinitely valid inspiration of the three words, Tat Vam Asi. Tat Vam Asi. That is what beyond truly means. Thou art that. This is, as a fruit to be picked from the cultural tree of Indian poetry, also a most simple expression of the absolutely true point of the convergence of all, therefore true poetry and philosophy. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank aus meinem Herz.
Oh, gern geschehen.
And ଆମର ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀ ମାନେ ଆମର ଡାଭିଡ ଅନେକ ମହତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ କଥା କହିଲେ ଆଉ my dear friends, just 1 minute and then we will invite Professor Khatri and friends. ସେଥିରେ ଡାଭିଡ କହିଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ହୋଲ୍ଡରଲିନ୍ ଯୋଉ କବି ସେ ଯୋଉ ରାଇମ କବିତାଟି ଲେଖିଲେ ଆଉ ସେଥିରେ ଯୋଉ କଥାଟି ରହିଛି ଗୋଟେ ଅନେକ ଅନୁଭବର କଥା, ଯେମିତି ଗୋଟେ ନୁନ୍ ଟାଇମରେ ମଧ୍ୟାହ୍ନ ସମୟରେ ଯେମିତି ଆସୁଛନ୍ତି ଆଉ ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଯୋଉ ବିଶ୍ୱ ସହିତ ଯୋଉ ଗୋଟେ ଅନୁଭବର କଥା ଆଉ ସେଠି ୱାର୍ଲଡ ପୋଏଟ୍ରି, ବିଶ୍ୱ କବିତା, ବିଶ୍ୱ ସାହିତ୍ୟଟା ଏମିତି ଗୋଟେ ଅନୁଭବରେ ସୃଷ୍ଟି ହୁଏ ସଂକ୍ଷେପରେ. So now, dear friends, we continue our conversations. So I invite Professor Patrick Laude to kindly help us, enrich us with his thoughts. Professor Patrick Laude, please. Please unmute yourself. Randhir, please unmute. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Giri. Thank you, Ananta. Thank you very much, Professor Bartosch. David, thank you very much. It was wonderful. It was a crescendo from the home and the homeland to Tatvamasi and all the way. All right, so I just want to share a few ideas very briefly, which may be connected with what we've heard, and perhaps it will open the way to other reflections. Very briefly, I was thinking first of all about actually there's a verse in Lucci, the 3rd century of the Christian era poet. In his Wenfu, he writes, of course it's the translation, and David would be able to recite it in Chinese. That would be much more interesting, but in English it reads, he, that is the poet, stands in the very center observes in the darkness, nourishes feeling and intent in the ancient canons. So we have, in a sense, everything here and many possible connections with what we've heard. We have the notion of center, this kind of cosmic center. The poet has the ability to be at the center, but being at the center is also at home. So this center is not any center. It's a center which is also his own center. And then we go back, of course, to the question of the language, the home, the culture, and all the questions related to the encounter between the universal and the particular, which are so important today, the questions of identities, and also, of course, striving for universality, for human universality, and how can the two be articulated. So he stands in the center and observes in the darkness. So there's a cosmic aspect. The center, I assume, also is also the center in the sense of the relationship between heaven and earth, Tien and Ti. But here he also observes in the darkness, and of course the darkness here is more than the mystery. It's really the mystery of being. It's the Wu Chi, I suppose, that is the non-being, the darkness beyond the light. Therefore, the metacosmic mystery of things, and we go to the end of the beautiful lecture of Professor Bartosch on Tatvamasi and this very mystery, which is the ineffable essence of every language, of every word. And then he nourishes feeling and intent in the ancient canons. So there's not only a cosmic aspect, there's not only a metacosmic, metaphysical aspect, but we also need this grounding in a home, in a language, in the culture, in a civilization, in a particularity, without which we are in a kind of abstract universality that remains unable to connect to other civilizations and cultures. I would like to ask a question, perhaps to Professor Bartosch to finish briefly. Is how do you see could you speak a little bit more about the relationship between poetry and philosophy, and the divorce between the two? That is, I'm speaking about the West. I'm speaking about Europe particularly, or the Western world. Of course, with the pre-Socratic, we have still philosophy and poetry are in a sense one. We can think of the poem of Parmenides, for example, as the best example perhaps of that. But then we see a divergence, we see diverging roads. And in a sense, Heidegger kind of alludes to that and perceives that as a loss, as a fundamental loss. So how do we account for this divorce between poetry and philosophy? Philosophy becoming more and more exclusively conceptual, and poetry becoming more and more, how should I say, even perhaps sentimental, idiosyncratic, and so forth.
That's a very good question. I mean, the way Occidental traditions took is really, I would say, can be reconstructed in a way that you have just explained. And why is that? It's a good question. I'm not pretty sure. I mean, there is something going on at the beginning of the Renaissance, I would say, where we see the re-emergence of poetic imagery or enigmata as a tool of philosophy. For example, the philosopher Nicholas Cusanus, Nicholas of Cusa, a German Central European thinker of the 15th century, lived from 1402 to 1464, comes to mind. He he has developed this notion of the docta ignorantia, the knowing unknowing, a way or particular ways to sorry, just a second. This is really disturbing here. I have to have my phone on because I'm otherwise I can't be on the internet, but it's constantly, I get calls constantly, so I have to somehow mute it. Just a second. Sorry for that. It's the technology interfering again. So now it's okay. Heidegger is with us here.
Yes, yes,
regard as well. Okay, but let me come back to this question. I think that Nicholas da Cusa has developed an approach. He speaks about enigmata. So a symbolism, certain kind of images, which might function as certain kind of pointing rods, if to use that metaphor by Max Scheler, semantische Zeigestäbe, pointing rods towards the ineffable. So in a certain sense here in this Renaissance intellectual mystic tradition, somehow this idea of the importance of imaginative symbolisms is re-emerging. So that's before Heidegger, of course, and I think that the German-speaking tradition since the 18th century, there are several figures who have, amongst them Goethe, of course, and Holderlin and others, who have kind of also already sensed the need to explore this inner dimension of what we might call universal nature in terms of more poetic approaches, enigmatic, cryptic, open semantics. Mm-hmm. Because, as I said, the I think also Cusano says that actually the highest goal of philosophy is to reach an unknowing self-evidence of that which is which is worded in all words, in an ineffable way. So, and poetry, of course, as an art form, is a prime way of bending back language to the source level of language. I think this cannot be done by in an either-or logical fashion, in a syllogistic Aristotelian way of thinking, of course. And the question why the Occidental traditions have developed in that direction is it's difficult to answer. I mean, if we go back to pre-Christian times, there are also these oral traditions in the Celtic traditions and the Germanic traditions, the poets, the knowing shaman-like pre-Christian traditions. They have cultivated also a very deep form of poetic imagery, which in a sense also was kept alive also in the folk traditions, I would say. So it is there, but it's not. It wasn't made conscious. Maybe there was this layer of Latin speaking scientia over it. I'm not sure. It's a very good question, but I think in the folk tradition also, if you ask me, some figures like, for example, Paracelsus, the famous doctor, philosopher, the medicine man, so to speak, of the 15th and 16th century, he also had he showed a great poetic imagination in his thinking, I would say. And of course, then we have other thinkers who developed also the German speaking philosophy tradition very early on, which were in touch with these more folkloristic ways of thinking. And I think there is some subcutaneous thing going on, but maybe it was always more kind of an oral tradition. So maybe it was never gone, and then it resurfaced maybe in the later German speaking tradition, and was reflected in more proper ways when the influence of Latin as a roof language for scientists was diminishing. Maybe so. It's just a theory, and in this regard, some thoughts in this direction.
So what you are describing is a kind of counter philosophy, or a kind of occult philosophy that was a kind of esoteric philosophy that was present but could not really appear in full light. And you also implied that there was perhaps the Latin Thomistic scholastic aspect that sort of covered up, so to speak, and prevented that dimension from flowering or blooming in Europe.
Maybe it was even blooming or flowering, but not officially.
Not officially, that's right. So it's a it's a hidden philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, and even if we talk about mystic traditions, I mean, there was not one level of standardized form of thinking, right? There were also the hidden mystical traditions, starting with Eriugena, Johann Scotus Eriugena, and they never vanished somehow. They always, the books were forbidden, but they were copied.
Meister Eckhart, Jacob Böhm, and others.
And Jacob Böhme is a very good example for this kind of poetic approach, which then was maybe. First, there is this Celtic, Irish, or Scottish Irish thinker Eriugena, who somehow introduced also this topic of nature into the Platonic, Neoplatonic Christian dialogue. Then, in the High Middle Ages, his books were abandoned or forbidden because they didn't fit the dogma, but because these writings were forbidden, they were read because they were so attractive. and
right.
I think that this poetic energy, which is in the Celtic tradition, in these northern traditions, in the Germanic tradition, it never vanished, and somehow it was. But it was resurfing very, very lately. Maybe we could put it like this, but it's just an assumption here. It's a conjecture. I'm not sure. I wouldn't put my stamp on it, but that's a conjecture from my side.
But certainly, it would be a contrast with my country of origin, France, for example. I don't find this. I'm looking for it, but it's very hard to find this kind of stream in French poetry, for example. Even in Romanticism, I don't find
maybe the influence of Latin Roman civilization was stronger in the region of the Eastern Franconian, and before that, when the region was a province of the Roman Empire.
That's right.
Maybe I'm not sure. I can't really put the finger to it, but I mean the Romans were also great. They also had great poets. So, but
yes.
But I think they were not connecting the poetry to the philosophical aspect so much. So maybe it's from there, because I'm sure that the Celtic Druidic Celtic traditions, they were very they were based on poetic imagery, I guess, the whole forms of rote learning. But of course, we don't have much evidence of it. And in the Central European regions, the oral poetic traditions they prevailed for longer time. So the influence of the scientia thinking and the dogma came to play in the 12th century approximately. But I'm not sure if this is a sufficient answer. It's just an assumption. Maybe we have to do more research together on that topic. I'm not quite sure.
So these are interesting avenues of exploration at the very least. Thank you.
Very honored.
Thank you, dear Patrick and David. We move on. So we invite Professor Asha Mukherjee, please. Asha D.
Hello,
everybody. Yeah. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be at such a distinguished panel. Thank you so much, Anantaji. And also thank you, David, Patrick, and John. Such a pleasure to be here. And Minadi, to see you here too. Yeah. So it's such a pleasure to be here. I really don't know where to start because David had sort of mesmerized all of us with his presentation in such a wonderful way that almost he has covered all the aspects of our literature, and there's hardly anything left for us. But yeah, I think I will share some of my views on Tagore, who has also written on world literature, and actually Anantaji has mentioned already. He has an article which is actually called as Vishwa Sahitya, world literature, and that has been translated by Makran Paranjape, our friend, as Ananta has already mentioned. But to understand that article, actually, one has to understand the background of Tagore's writings. And actually, Tagore was very much influenced by Goethe, as you can see. And he has, he had a lot of influence of Goethe and the literary writers of almost all the world. Actually, he was a very extremely well-read person, and he has written. A huge literature he has left with us, and he was very widely accepted and received by the world itself. So, with that background, Tagore has a lifelong writing, which can be expressed in as one term: home and the world. Now, if you call this as home and the world, which is the category actually which I'm using for Tagore's all writings, if I really want to put them in one category, so it may be called as home and the world. And we have these three overlapping but distinct levels of society. The domestic sphere versus the public sphere, the first one. Second one is the community versus the larger society. And the third one is nation state versus the rest of the world. Now, all the writings can be categorized into these three broadly sort of, categories, which I'm trying to put them. All these intersecting levels create insider and outsider. Now, at every level, we have an insider and an outsider. At each of these three levels, boundaries are constructed. Within each level also, there are boundaries which are constructed to create freedom for some at the cost of excluding some others. Now, that's the most interesting part, that at each level we have boundaries, and at the cost of excluding some others, we are having these boundaries. Now, Tagore whole life attempted to contest all kind of dichotomies and also all kind of boundaries in order to create harmony. As harmony, actually, David was talking about harmony as a virtue and connectedness. So for Tagore as well, harmony and connectedness, they were extreme. They were the virtues, and they were similar to almost like a kind of boundaries, like personal is political. So all these boundaries he tried to break by all this literature. Now let me begin with the notion of this notion of state and nation. Now for Tagore, nation state, this whole category actually. Uh, mm, Now, before I go to the nation and state, actually, perhaps I should also introduce the notion of Mahamanav. He has a song, Oi Mahamanav Ashe, and Dike Dike Romanch Lage. Now, these are the wordings. You can look at this thing. But this connectedness and harmony, actually, this Mahamanav is the representation of the human at the large, of the highest human, which actually we reached by the highest humanity that we reached by connectedness, infiniteness, as David was using the words. So this Mahamanav, actually, the concept of Mahamanav, which Tagore has in his literature, is actually the kind of reality which can be achieved by connectedness, yet it is infinite, which can never be reached. It's like an ideal which has to be conceived by every poet and every philosophy. So for him, the philosophy and poetry, they are not separate. I mean, I think Patrick was talking about that, that in German tradition he found a divorce. But in Tagore, there's no divorce between the poetry and philosophy. For him, poetry and philosophy, they are so interwoven, they are so much two sides of the same coin that they cannot be separate. So, so coming back to the distinction between nation and state, Tagore actually says that I mean the notion I'm quoting. He writes the notion of West forges its iron chains of organization, which are the most relentless and unbreakable that have been ever manufactured. Not merely the subject races, but you who live under the delusion that you are free. He's referring to the West, are every day sacrificing your freedom and humanity to the fetish of nationalism. So, nationalism is ingrained in the Western tradition, and he actually is looking for free dialogue of world cultures. In his early essays on nationalism, published in 1917, and later on it's reprinted many times, he's talking about free dialogue of world cultures, breaking the boundaries, and looking for harmony. We Indians must remember that we are individuals with living sensibilities. We must remember the spirit of conflict and conquest is at the origin and center of Western nationalism. While talking of Japan, India, and China, Tagore says that Eastern Asia has followed its own path, which are not political but social, not predatory and mechanically efficient, but spiritual, and based upon the varied and deeper relations of humanity. So he's talking about the relation of humanity which can connect, which literature can connect us. And on the basis of this, he built up. He actually built up this notion of Vishwa Sahitya, that is world literature. And actually, the notion of Vishwa Sahitya or world literature, originally this essay was written in Bengali, and very lately actually it has been translated. In 1961, perhaps by Shishir Kumar Ghosh, it was translated for the first time, and later on, Makarad Paraji also tried to translate it. But it's really unfortunate. This paper, which was extremely important, was not translated for so many years. So this notion of Vishwa Sahitya, world literature, is as self-giving. So through world literature, the human beings can self-give and relating to others. So the notion of self-giving and relating to others, connectedness, these are fundamental for world literature. Without these two notions, Tagore is not talking. I mean, these are the fundamentals for world literature. So if it's going to be world literature, then it has to be self-giving. David was talking about home and then coming out of the boundaries. One has to learn from one has to be grounded in one's own language and then learn some foreign language to see what your home looks like. David was using this concept. So it's similar to that, like you have to, it's like your grounding has to be left out. You have to leave your own grounding and come out of it. So it is like self-giving. So it's not simply that that you have to come out of your grounding, but also you have to give yourself. In that sense, then only you will be able to understand the outsider. So it's not simply just learning the other's language, but also you have to learn the language in such a way that you leave your own language to, and I mean the notion of belongingness that has to be rejected for the time being. I mean, it's not rejected for all, for all the time, but for the time being, so that you can understand the other. So this notion of self-giving is extremely important for Tagore, for world literature. Now, there are three ways that in which we can relate to the world according to Tagore: connection of the intellect, connection of the need, and the connection of joy. Now, connection of intellect, as you can see in science, I mean, like just a few minutes ago, we were talking about Renaissance. And science actually made us, maybe the divorce which Patrick was talking about was because of the science, the prominence of science and technology, perhaps that might have affected the poetic kind of trend or philosophical trend which was present, so much prevalent in German tradition. But then Tagore is saying that there are three connections. They are simultaneous: the connection of the intellect, connection of the need, and the connection of joy. And actually, it's the poetry. Poetry is in the connection of joy. The first lies in the way the scientist relates to the material world, in the understanding and discovering the laws and the mysteries of nature. In doing so, it realizes itself. The second is the self relates in needs of others. When self-interest motivates our connection with the world, we do know and understand ourselves and others more and more, yet the barrier remains. So if it is the connection of a need, then knowing the other, still the barrier will remain. So it's not self-giving. It's not the paradigm of self-giving. When I need some kind of knowledge from such kind of webinar, and I want to know what David is saying, now this is actually need-based kind of connection. So this connection is not self-giving. And in that sense, the second is so self relates with the need of others, but then this connection of the world is needed. And here we do not know and understand ourselves and others more and more. Yet the barrier remains. But in joy, there's no doubt. There are no questions. It's direct experience. So when when there are no questions, when we actually are in joy, when we feel the joy in the connectedness with others, the joy lies in self-giving. There's no self-interest. We cannot realize ourselves without some form of self-giving and relating to others. On our own, we remain restricted and unfulfilled. This is again a quote. The sole purpose of our talents is to know others and give ourselves to them, without that we cannot reach. The truth of our being. We were talking about the truth of our being. But the truth of being we cannot reach without self-giving. Our human condition. Tagore, by extending the limits of the traditional Vedantism. So you can see that, basically the ancient tradition, Tagore is actually working the same and also extending the limits of traditional Vedantin framework that sees itself being contained in and of itself accepts the reality of the phenomenal world as essential for self-completion. So self-giving is a part of self-completion in Vedantin tradition. The great souls need to do the work for others. So it's not simply for myself, but it is also for others. Tagore considers knowing oneself through and among others as a dharma, as a categorical imperative of our times. So for Tagore, it's a categorical imperative as a self-giving. Rationality in both ethical and aesthetic position, the self being content in and for itself, which is again from Bhagavad Gita, considering phenomenal world as essential for self-realization. So self-realization is the aim, as you know, moksha is the aim, the goal for Indian philosophy, and therefore he is influenced by that kind of. So he talked about the joy, as we said. So in creativity, joy, beauty, and the relationship is of a different kind. So it's a different kind of relationship that we find in joy, beauty, and relation. And that's again not only simply the poetry, but also in any art form. Actually, for Tagore, any art form it will give joy. The former is calculating, the latter of giving and liberating. The relationship of joy with the world is as an outcome of the soul's deep involvement in fullness. So it is soul's, it is, uh, uh, it's a soul's deep involvement in fullness. He says, to quote, the heart seeking to express itself. The world is full of enjoyment, relish, and beauty, which is transmitted into its own creative self giving and takes the form of literature or art. So he does not really make any basic distinction between poetry and art. There's actually, I mean, for him, art and literature both are equally joy giving. And I mean, he actually uses the word Ananda Yagya. It's like a Yagya of Ananda. So it's like giving Ahuti. So you give yourself as an Ahuti and you participate in the Ananda Yagya of life. Our heart's deepest urge can only be realized in its meeting the outside world in an act of self giving, through which it finds its self expression and fulfillment. So the notion of self-giving is extremely the basic thing. I do not really want to take much time, as when you can see that I mean, I've already taken more than 10 minutes, I suppose. But maybe I would like to. I mean, since David is there, I mean, like he was so much received by the whole world, and his literature, Gitanjali, was translated. I don't know how many languages, and he was very well received by China and Japan, as you all know. And when David was
Very
talking about the
important
languages,
connection, right? Mm.
yeah. So
Very
I
important,
just
yeah.
say,
Oh, I just said I agree. He's a very important bridges builder between
right, exactly, in the whole world, exactly. So not
yeah.
only he wrote about the world literature, but also he actually
Right.
connected himself with the whole world through his literature. Not only the poems, but also the music and dance and drama and essays and novels, etc. So he is actually the bridge builder of the whole world, no doubt about it. And I'll just give you an example of China, India, China, of self giving and relating to others. I'm sure David must be knowing, but maybe I'll just mention about this. The Chinese intellectual discovered Rabindranath Tagore much before he received Nobel Prize in 1913. Tagore was the first Asian to receive such honor, and Chinese could relate themselves with Tagore's writing, especially due to collapse of ancient monarchy and the uncertainties of the newborn republic. Influenced by new Western ideas, Tagore and Chinese intellectuals both were struggling to find ways to reconcile modern and ancient wisdom. Tagore's ideas and China's modern awakening complemented each other, and new cultural movement that began in 1919 was started in China with equal enthusiasm. This is, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing properly, but excuse me for that. Tanchung, his writing, Tanchung and Wei Fleming is actually writing about this. So, seeing the merits of relevance of Tagore's poetry in China awakening, Tagore's poems were translated and published in the journal Shuonian Zhongguo, that is Young China, of Young China Association founded by Chinese Communist Movement. Li Zhao, the Peking University librarian, who was the member of the Mao Zedong. These translations were from a serious realization of the power of the word of progressive thinking and of the patriotic patriotic appeal in Tagore's words. And his poem, which is actually a part of Gitanjali, where the mind is without fear. I'm sure most of you know about this. From Gitanjali was translated into Chinese, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up with fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where the tireless striving stretches its arm towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of the dead habit, where the mind is held, had led forward by thee into ever widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my father led my country away. Now, this was translated in Chinese, and Shen, with his mastery in adoption and translated this poem into Chinese. Just as in India, this poem inspired innumerable people to struggle for independence in China. Shen selected it as a song of volunteers. He called it a song of volunteers, and now this is the national anthem of China. So you can imagine, the kind of the transformation which can take place by the poetry, by the influence of literature. So this is the kind of connectedness which Tagore is talking about. That I'm sure that you know that his play Post Office, that was used by Poland for the Second World War, when actually they were preparing the children for the Holocaust, for the Second World War, where the school children were actually they actually got killed in the large numbers. So people prepared the children by the play Postmaster in Poland, using Tagore's play. Now, this is the power of literature which he's talking about, and this is the actually power of the literature which David was talking about. So literature and arts, I would extend it's not simply the poetry. And also I would like to point out that in Indian tradition, poetry does not have so much role to play in ancient India, at least. We have actually play, which is more important for us. Bharata's this rasa theory, which is actually the aesthetic experience. I can't really translate rasa theory, but then this aesthetic experience basically is actually the whole thing is based on the play. So, as in the West, we have poetry. In the Eastern tradition, at least in ancient Indian tradition, we have the plays and the role of play. In the whole society is extremely the kind of anukriti, the kind of the enactment of this, the role which the person plays, the real life of the person, then the role in the play, the character which he's playing, that is anukriti, and then the real and the unreal, both the real, the thing, person and non-person, they actually act at the same time. Now, this non-person, one has to give up one's own reality, which is experiential reality, and then become what, like in Shakuntalam also, if you take an example of Shakuntalam, one has to become the character which one is playing. And then when you become the character, as you are playing, in the West, normally you have, in Greek tragedy, etc., they had masks. But in Indian tradition, we did not have masks, which was basically like you sort of pretend as if you are that character. So it is real as well as, and the artist role was, the perfect artist was the one who was playing that perfect unreal role. So person and non-person, they actually both, are played together. The person who is playing the Othello, the role of Othello, he has to be Othello on the stage, the perfect Othello at the stage. Then only his artistic work is appreciated. But at the same time, he has to forget his own identity. And the character, when he comes out of this thing, he is the same character. So the person and non-person. So this giving up, self-giving, that's actually the kind of the self-giving concept is also ingrained in the Rust theory. That's what I was trying to point out. I'm sorry, I mean, if it made any sense, but maybe I'll just raise one or two issues with when this subject-object distinction which David was making. I was remembering actually we have a very illustrious philosopher. I'm sure you must have, since you are from philosophy, you must have heard his name, Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, K.C. Bhattacharya, who has actually, who was very much influenced by the German philosophers and especially Kant, and he has also used the subject-object distinction, and that perhaps would also bring out the kind of distinctions which you were making. But at the same time, K.C. Bhattacharya actually makes a very different kind of exploration of Kantian philosophy, taking clue from Vedanta. So it is Kant from Vedantin position. That's what Krishna Bhattacharya has done, and he has a book on Vedanta studies as well. So that might interest you. It was simply just a comment, and I may also like to say one thing regarding this self-giving, as I'm coming back and forth. So in poetry also, it's like at the same time, as you've talked about, within the home, within the boundary wall of the house, one has to have a home, but the home has to be transformed. So the grounding and then transforming, and not simply transforming, but also transcending. So there's another level which has to be added perhaps. So it's not simply just the transforming, but also transcending. Unless you transcend, because the examples which you are using in the poetry.
With respect, maybe Asadi, if
Yeah.
it is okay, you can kindly.
Yeah. So this is just the last point. Yeah, this is just the, so maybe the transcending part is also has to be added, that part, within, because when you're talking about spirituality, the poem which you have used, so transcending is essential. This is what I feel for world literature in that sense. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Asadi. I request David to kindly take note of it, and then we'll listen to a little later after we listen to Professor John Clammer. So, John, please.
Okay, thank you, Ananta, and everyone, and thank you, David, for your very inspiring talk. I can say brief because I'm afraid we're way over time, and I'm in Kyoto, and it's very late at night there. So I will try to wrap up
later than here. I also have to bring my son to bed soon.
Your talk inspired a feeling of nostalgia in me, because I had lived in Weimar at the time, taught at Bauhaus Universität some years ago for some time. And as you talked, one of the things that struck me is those familiar with religious studies obviously are very aware of the notion of the axial age. The period in which many of the great religions arose fairly close to one another, this kind of transformative period, whatever triggered that kind of amazing transformation of the kind of religious culture. But as you talked, I was thinking, in fact, of indeed Weimar, because that very period you were talking about was, in fact, a kind of mini axial age. And another interesting question for maybe sociologists of knowledge. Other cities in the West have had similar periods. Vienna, perhaps, at the turn of the century, in the 1900s onwards, with philosophers, psychologists, Freud, Wittgenstein, any number of painters and creative people right at the same place, or maybe Paris at roughly the same time. And yet, centered in that part of central Germany, you had something similar going on. In Weimar, of course, Goethe lived there and attracted Schiller to join him. A few miles to the east is Jena, of course, where Hegel was active, as you said. right? And a few miles to the west is the little town of Eisenach, where Johann Sebastian Bach was born. So something was going on.
And Luther studied in Erfurt in the
fascinating question, right?
Martin Luther studied also in Erfurt, the capital of the federal state today, Turingen.
But it seems to me this kind of strange historical and geographical conjunction, in fact, raises fascinating questions, which I think you've touched on. Some of the other commentators have referred to in a way. The university I teach at when I'm in India, in OP Jindal University, one of the words you hear constantly around the campus is this very horrible word they call interdisciplinarity. And we're supposed to make everything, interdisciplinary. We're supposed to always, dissolve boundaries, easier said than done. But yet, if one looks back to this very period, I think we find interdisciplinarity at work long before that concept was thought up. It was active, very active. If you take the case of Goethe, for example, he was not only, a writer, a poet, he was prime minister of Weimar, of the state for some period, and of course attracted a whole galaxy of other very profoundly interesting cultural figures around him. His house still stands there as one of the kind of cultural features of the city of Weimar. It's now a museum. He wrote on color, he wrote on form, he wrote about nature. He was interested in the emergence of organic forms in nature. So a politician, a philosopher, a writer, I don't know where you would classify him, and I think today's concern with classifying is in perhaps a rather recent phenomenon. And when you look at the lives of any of these people, we find, I think, in fact, that you referred to tonight, we find, in fact, the same phenomenon in progress. We've created boundaries which are in many ways actually really very artificial. And I think this historical period tells us something about exactly the way in which those boundaries are temporary, are capable of being transcended in all sorts of ways, in which the distinction between philosophy and poetry perhaps is a weak one, or between philosophy and the study of nature is weak. Ideas which, interestingly, are now all coming back into contemporary discourse, whether in the form of new forms of spirituality, new forms of thinking about nature, of deep ecology, whatever you have.
Media explosion that we have, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, it seems to be
the whole data, AI, everything that we have, I think the future, what will count is the creativity, the ways in which we might be able to naturally fuse all kinds of aspects and directions into new, new levels to help to create the emergence of new levels of understanding and arts. And I think the possibilities are boundless, right?
Very much so, very much so. And when I was first attracted to philosophy myself was because my father, in fact, was brought home a book once by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, an illustrated history of philosophy, a book called The Wisdom of the West. There wasn't much about Asia in there. And it had pictures, it had diagrams, it had pictures of Hegel, it had pictures of Kant, it had pictures of everybody, Marx, and all those were great figures. And if they couldn't find a picture, at least there was what somebody thought Socrates looked like, and so on. And as I started burrowing into this wonderful book, which fascinated me, was the feeling that, of course, the original, what would you call it, motive for philosophical thought was the search for wisdom. Mm-hmm. And having studied philosophy, as many of us probably have at university, of course, I found that was not on the agenda at all. There were many technical questions which were peripheral in a way to that, but that notion of wisdom had somehow got lost. And it seems to me that when you begin to talk about the relationship between philosophy and poetry, this is one of the pointers to the way back to that. As many of you pointed out just this evening, of course, in the quotations that you gave, that Ananta gave, for example, that a lot of people, I think, see poetry as a source of the human imagination. And I think it's very true that two things are very true. One is that it is imagination that leads to our conceiving of those more abstract patterns of thought that we later come up with and call philosophy. But they have to emerge from somewhere in human experience. And I think the second thing is that in my own experience, the very interesting ideas arise either from the edges or exactly when the apparently dissimilar come together. They generate a kind of energy. So I would basically wrap up by saying just a couple of things. First of all, I think you've pointed to a fascinating moment in history, in a way, when you're looking at the origins of this kind of thought, when exactly that kind of synergy was happening. To some extent, some of it got lost. But as you were pointing out in answer to an earlier question, a lot of it's not really lost. I think it's just gone underground. And it's then possible, I think, now to be able to mine those traditions. They may have disappeared into a form of mysticism. They may have produced, maybe now, in certain forms of ecological thinking, but they are in fact still there. They appear as a kind of subterranean level, I think, of a great deal of not only philosophy, but religious thought as well. They surface in poetry. And I think this is probably what you were suggesting, that it's a mistake, therefore, to think of poetry as a sort of peripheral activity. Not at all. It's actually the fountainhead or the well, whichever kind of image you wanted to use, that actually takes us back to that deep strata. And I think it's probably in that deep strata that we're going to find many of the answers that are now facing our kind of planetary civilization. So far from being historical, I think you've touched on issues which are profoundly contemporary, and we should listen to those voices that are reaching us, whether from the past or present. They are in fact extremely contemporary. So thank you so much, David, for your talk.
Thank you very much for your comment. Very much appreciated. And I think this is, what you say is exactly, and also what Asha has said is exactly, both of you pointed out the important points here. I think we are at a breaking point in world history, right? It's never been, it's a completely new situation. We have all these technologies upcoming. There are all these problems that we are slowly becoming conscious of: climate warming and the mass extinction of in the biosphere. And at the same time, we probably have the solutions to go on, but what we need, I think, on a global scale is a change of mindset, in a sense, which has to be inclusive, right? It has to be inclusive, cannot be unidirectional, cannot be just one dogmatic angle. It has to represent the ancient civilizations as well as their modern representations, in the sense of an organism, maybe, right? Where you can't take out one organ of the body will die, right? So they all have a function, they all have to provide something that the cultural tradition have to provide. But what's more, we have to find a common denominator. And I think in the poetry, what we can find here is this notion of life, right? The great poetry teaches this, or is trying to touch upon what we might also call universal life, right? We even in science now, we become conscious that maybe life is not restricted to our planet, right? There are research papers discussing the possibility that bacteria can travel through space and maybe land on planets which are habitable, and then biospheres develop. All these thoughts are going on, and we have this vast expansion now of our perspective. And I think that poetry can also be, as it is the basic, most cultivated form of human of the ways that humans communicate. Namely, it's the cultivation of language, right? Of languages. And poetry and a translation might help to open us for these perspectives of the universality of life, and also uplift life on this planet in our consciousness, and our consciousness, of course, is part of life. It's a very important part of life on this planet, and maybe the philosophy can fulfill a very important function in the communication of civilizations, because of course civilizations are different. They have grown in different places of the world, and they have developed different ways of organizing themselves, and sometimes they are not or they are not complementary in a sense, or they cannot they found other solutions, right? So but we have to find a way to make them somehow complementary, and I think if we can find a common denominator which everyone can accept, and I think this is to be found in culture, in self-refinement here, then we have a tool to revive our humanity on a global scale, without negating the different forms of culture, because they are our treasury, right? The plurality of culture is our big treasury. We can always draw inspirations from all ancient civilizations. There are so many useful ideas and things, and also parallels. And I was just thinking also the self-giving. Asha mentioned this idea of self-giving, and I had a lot of associations. On one side, I was thinking of Kant a little bit, who also in terms of his aesthetics, he talks about interest-free pleasure. Interest-free pleasure. So interesseloses Wohlgefallen. Maybe we can translate it as interest-free pleasure. I don't know if you would like the translation, but I think it's close. And I think this is also this is what we, this is maybe also the aesthetic component here, which brings us closer to the identification with the whole, and poetry, great poetry, can serve as a mediator into that realm of creating an interest-free way of pleasure, of true pleasure, of the great pleasure of life, of universal life, planetary life, that we can take and partaking in this wonder, right? And on the other hand, I was thinking also, I was thinking of Chinese philosophy. There is a great thinker of the 15th and 16th century, goes by the name Wang Yangming. And also Wang Yangming, he developed this idea that we have an intuitive sense of what is right. Intuitively, it's instantaneous. And it's also related to constantly abandoning, in Chinese it's called 自私自利, so selfish desires. So it's like a training. We have to constantly try to cut off the egoistic interest as soon as it pops up. And he says we have an intuitive sense of what is right, and we can train that. And he compared it to polishing a mirror. Polishing a mirror, the metaphor stems from Taoism, from ancient Chinese Taoism, but also from Buddhism. So it's also an Indian metaphor, polishing the mirror. And you would even find that in Plato, in ancient Greece. So there's this idea that we have to strive to perfect ourselves. And I think self-giving, as you have put it, is indeed a very fundamental aspect here, because if you give yourself what you attain the whole constantly, right? You're in the flow with universal life. The flow that the poets tap into when they manage to express a certain situation in its wholeness and in its universality. I think that's maybe that's I think that's the way we can balance the future developments. And indeed, as Professor Clammer said, I think poetry, I also agree that poetry plays a central, or can play a central role here, especially in our media times, right? We can communicate poetry so quickly in the internet, and it's short. It can be very short aphorisms and phrases, and young people love short expressions today. so it's a great way of raising the awareness, and I have greatest respect for the younger upcoming generations, by the way. So we shouldn't underestimate them, and I think the poetic element here, if we can help them to find a way into that poetic form of reflection on an inter-civilizational way, we can balance our problems. I'm optimistic, by the way. Life will find a way, and poetry is one of its important expressions.
Thank you, David. And thank you, dear friends. I realize we are into the embrace of time, and it is getting late for John also, for both of you. Maybe a very few minutes, just 5 minutes or so. We'll quickly have a few very brief reflections from our friends. And so, dear friends, those of you who like to share some thoughts quickly, so we invite you, please put it into chat or please share. So please, Professor Bira Chakrabarti, please.
Yes. Kindly unmute yourself, ma'am. Please unmute yourself, ma'am. Yes, please unmute yourself. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
There's a fact check with Asha that there is not much of poetry in ancient India. There is the whole Upanishads have a lot of poetry. The epics have poetry, and in the classical literature, a play also is full of poetry as well as prose. That is for Asha. And for David, I am very sorry because I just confused the time. I thought it was between 7 and 9, so I just joined late. But what you said, the last comment, David, is that you like the hot expression of the younger generation, which is there. But I am feeling a little bizarre because Plato, being a student of Socrates, tries to ban some pages, some portions of Homer that the students shouldn't see because it is not giving any moral values. So I found that when Faust was also published by Goethe, the Christian church was very unhappy about it. And so this kind of, going to poetry, we go to poetry not for information, we go to poetry for enjoyment, we go to poetry for experience. So therefore, I think have to not also look at this side where there is the moral values and moralizing also. Like, for example, I mean, you have also the painting, the biblical story of Salome, with John Baptist's head on his head. Now, you just paint it. I mean, the Titian, who's a Renaissance painter, depicts it, and just leave it to the people to see as to what, not pass judgment. Similarly, he also, I mean, Tagore also doesn't pass judgment. So why is this that there is this kind of even abstract art? It may not have a representational value, but it has a moral value which people will pick up. So why this kind of moralizing and the moral values, or the distinction that the art has to play, or art isn't as kind of Henry James have done and others have done, just leave it to the people. Why does it have? So when you say hot expression, you are also passing some kind of a judgment where you say this is hot and this is not hot. In the lighter vein, there's some kind of thing that, well, we always find that, okay, today's music is like this and yesterday's music like this. All the time there's this categorization that's going on. So how do you think, how do you try to look at this perspective, which has been done right? That's why I took example from right from Plato, and mind you, Socrates was against it. So this is very bizarre that being a student of Socrates, Plato does that, makes boundaries, which Socrates doesn't allow. So right from that to today, there is these things which are going on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am.
Now we have Swadhyaya who has raised. Swadhyaya has raised her hand.
Okay.
Can I just give a clarification to Meeradi? Actually, I did not say that there is no poetry in dictation. I only said that it is in the context of rasa theory that the emphasis is on the play and not on poetry. I think she missed the point. Thank you.
So we'll come to this towards the end, Ashaji. So now, Swadhyaya, please.
Thank you, Bhai. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you, dear Randhir. And thank you, Dr. David, for a very engaging and enchanting presentation. I just have a small question. In the interest of time, I'll try to make it as short as possible. But so do poetry, and this question of mine also has stemmed from, you know, from your presentation, as well as the discussion on poetry and, you know, the relationship between philosophy. So I was listening to the question of Dr. Patrick, and also Dr. John Clammer also was talking on that. So the question is, I would try to make a point in the form of a question rather, so that I'm leaving it to be discussed or deliberated further by our orchestra. And the question is, do philosophy and poetry, or rather to say the philosophical poetry, since we, you know, if we have to agree that not all poetry is philosophical, although the line of distinction is key. So do they somewhere, you know, in their awareness of oneness and the cosmic consciousness, dismiss the differences in cultures, in lives or livings, and thereby sometimes suffer the disconnect from the mass, from the you know, from the general audience? And is this a challenge to the world literature? And how real is that challenge? And are there you know, what are the approaches for the solution if the challenge is serious enough?
Thank you.
So with that, yeah, I would stop, though I have few more points, but I would stop in the interest of time. And I would thank everyone once again.
Yes, Dr. J.S. Anand, sir, would you like to make any comment?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
May I speak?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, sir. If you can kindly video on.
I don't have any message here. Okay. Here it is.
Yes, yes.
Hello, friends. Good evening to all of you. I was listening to some of the debate and discussion that was going on, although I joined you quite late, but I was able to follow what was going on. And I wish to say a few words, a few observations, because I am a practicing poet, more than an academician. And after authoring around 90 books, I have some ideas about creativity, which I can share here. There was a talk about by Mr. Lim was saying that there is a, you know, divorce between poetry and philosophy, and some other issues also. I believe that it is a connection of body and soul. You cannot divorce the two. If you divorce the two, it is dead. So philosophy, I would say that it is not the words, it is not the language that summons the thoughts. It is the thoughts who summon the words and the language. So language is always secondary to the original thought of the author. What he wants, moreover, the poetry that lives, it lives down the ages, not because of its words, but because of the ideas that are contained in those words, in those particular patterns. So I would like to comment here that there is also idea of giving away or self-giving, I mean, or moving transcendence, moving from towards infinity. A poet is not an independent identity. He is connected with the society. He is connected with the cosmos also. He is a part of the cosmos. So when he tries to communicate, he is not communicating with one person. He is communicating with the cosmos. So we are always in communication with our actions, with our thoughts, and the poet with his very chosen words. He is talking to the world, he is talking to the cosmos. We think that we take in poetry because we know English. Even if we don't know English, even if we don't know words, even then we are able to communicate with objects of nature. So the poet stands in direct relationship with whatever lies outside him. And I was very impressed by the idea of Lim, that the poet is at the center. He is the center of the universe while he is creating. But he has to do something, he has to create something which relates to others, not only physically, but also philosophically. So I don't believe that any poetry can live which does not carry philosophy with it. So these are my few observations. I am really impressed, Dr. David. You were wonderful. And Anu, I heard Anu also. She said so well about Tagore and Indian tradition. Indian tradition is about universality, the one moving towards the other. And we don't believe in any divorce between poetry and philosophy. It is the philosophy which directs poetry. If you don't have anything to say, why will you write poetry? Then anybody can write anything. It is not merely for joy. Joy is one part of the exercise. But if it is only joy, then we are just going about, a healthy boy's delight, as Wordsworth said in Tintern Abbey. But he progressed from that initial delight to something far more interfused in the world outside. So we have to transcend. We are all talking about transcending and all these things. Thank you very much. All these were very rewarding for me also. Although I was not in a mood to get into it, but the things just impelled me to talk to you. Thank you very much, David, and all other friends. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As we move along very quickly, we have a request from Shobhana. I request friends and also another. Just take a minute to share your thought. Shobhana, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Giri. I was just going to talk more about how Tamil literature, especially you have great poets like Thiruvalluvar, where his first couplet is towards dedicating himself to the Lord. It's Agara Mudala Ezhuthellam Adi Bhagavan Mudatre Uladu. It is dedicating yourself, surrendering yourself to the words towards the Lord. And then, of course, you've got the great poet during the freedom times, Visvabharati, when he talks of nature. He talks of how you communicate with nature, especially in his Kuil Patu, where he talks about how the mind, and here the metaphor that he uses is the monkey is, the mind is like a monkey, and what happens to the monkey when it drinks a little bit of toddy and it is stung by a scorpion? What happens to the mind then? I mean, that kind of poetry which talks of reaching ecstasy at that level where you transcend the body and the mind and you go beyond all that. I think poetry has been the base of any kind of ultimate expression of words. So, and here, as I would like to slightly suggest, yes, poetry has always been the underlying foundation of most of the literature in South India, especially. So saying during the ancient times, we did not have poetry, I think I would not agree to that. Poetry was the first way of expression of any thought idea was always through poetry, especially the couplets, whether it is from Tiruvalluvar or from the four major arvars of Lord Shiva, where the kind of surrender that they talk about, the body as a home and surrendering to the outside. You have to read those kind of poetries to experience the feeling that goes through there. So please do consider a little bit of the South Indian literature also, poems also, as a part of it has always been ignored.
Very important, very
Yes,
important. All the facets of the whole of South Asian, Indian civilization have to be considered. And of course, the South Indian civilization is so fascinating and mind-boggling.
It's so fascinating. It's mind-boggling, exactly.
And it's one of the most ancient spoken languages, right? Tamil language. So and it's connected through to many.
It's so connected to the nature. It is just the connection of the humans or the Homo sapiens to the
a language of a seafaring civilization. So in a sense, like the Greek civilization has brought forth a lot of inspiration and also has had a great poetic imagination. So, and luckily, I don't speak all these languages. I have to study more, at least to get some more understanding of all the major.
I'm a born Tamilian, but I still am. I like how there is a saying in Tamil. What you know is only a handful. What you don't know is the huge ocean out there.
Exactly. This is why I was saying we all have our personal perspectives on the whole, right? Because we are finite. Yes. We have a little grain of sand in our hands, but the little grain of sand is part of the whole. And I think it's fascinating also when I studied Chinese civilization, the culture, there's also very much at the root of Chinese civilization, there's also poetry. There's in Confucian tradition, there's the book of odes or book of songs. It's called the Shi Jing. Yes. And it's fascinating. You will find many similarities with Indian traditions. You will find similarities between some. Not everything is similar, but there are touching points between Confucian ancient thoughts and South Indian thoughts and
very true
North Indian thoughts. So there are a lot of resonances, and I think
a lot of resonance. Yes,
a lot of resonance, and the differences are also beautiful because the differences are the different solutions people found to reflect on the general human problems and situations in different geographical situations.
Geographical situation, yes.
Yeah, they are enriching us today. I think we should try to preserve them. We have to communicate them to even to create new products. I mean, even if we would think in terms of economy here, I mean, we are thinking very lofty schemes here with poetry, but even there are other levels of culture, and this is our treasury, right? All these traditions. That's why I think we have to also help the younger generations to make them more conscious of the
richness,
the vitality of all these civilizations. So make the young people all over the world curious about other civilizations, cultures. And even if we just grab a little grain of sand ourselves, it's for us. It's
one grain of sand is enough. Yes, true. Thank you so much for giving me opportunity. Thank you, David. Yeah.
Wonderful.
dear
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Dear David, so we had some other queries very quickly also, I think.
Okay, I have to say I don't have, it's already very late here because I have to check for for my family now.
Okay. Okay, so then very
quickly. I'm sorry to interrupt here, but I really have to move on now because it's already 10:30 here.
So then I think we would be on a way to wrap it up in a few minutes. And
but you can discuss further. You can please don't. I would encourage you to.
We would wrap up in just a few minutes.
Okay, I see. Okay.
So yes, then. So very quickly, would you have some thoughts to the questions that were posed to you by Susri Opa? Like, do you remember that question?
Yes.
Maybe take just a minute to.
I was thinking that actually, in my opinion, just to try to make it as short as possible, it's again like last time when we spoke, it's a very important and wonderful question. And again, I think the this level what she was expressing of this poetic universal consciousness, I think it's not devoid of difference. Right. When we talk about the philosophical reflections, also in this regard, we might think of Hegel's expression of the unity and difference. So we cannot have an all-encompassing unity without including the differences. So if we try to get rid of the differences to reach some kind of unified field experience, then we would still perform an act of differentiating. So we would still be in a differentiating, conceptualizing scheme of thinking, although it would maybe a very it would be devoid of content, but in a formal sense we would still think in terms of either or. So it's either you know, these kind of Yogacara and all these kind of ancient forms of logic. It's a way of integrating the difference in poetic reflection, and then the interesting thing happens. I think the insight that we can gain is that the difference, the thing that, oh, there's not the thing, the mind drawing the line which creates consciousness, which creates knowledge. This line drawing, to use that metaphor, I think has also been brought up by, I think I read this also in Nicholas Luhmann somewhere also as well, and a few weeks ago. So I'm not the only one who's using this metaphor. So this line drawing in itself, this distinction is without distinctions. So it's infinite. So imagine a wall, right? Imagine a wall which divides one side of the landscape from the other side of the landscape. Imagine, for example, walking on the Chinese wall, right? When you walk on the wall, you experience the unity of the two sides as well. So it's not just, the wall is not just separating, it's also at the same time, it's also the unification of the side left of the wall and right side of the wall. So the border is also the connection. And in the same sense, that which enables us to create precise concepts, this definition, as we call that, right? The making finite in itself contains the infinite creativity of the knowing unknowing, as Nicholas Kouzanos has called it. And he also used the metaphor of the wall. He spoke of the wall of paradise, the Murum Paradisi in one of his books. So I think in this poetic consciousness we are not devoid of the differences, but we have to, so to speak, to walk on top of the in German it's Kontinuum, so on top of that of the line which divides, and writing on the difference means that we have this unity, while at the same time including the difference. I think this is the higher idea of this is expressed in different way, for example, also in the philosophy of Hegel and in dialectic thinking in general, and in many traditions, not just in the Occidental tradition, but in the Occidental tradition, you could think of Heraclitus, for example. Then we can think of Vedanta, of course, right? The Vedanta is based on that form of higher logic. I call it foundational logic, Grundlogik in German. The unity of unity and difference. You find that in Chinese philosophy, the same basic form of consciousness is expressed in various ways, in various contexts, various vocabularies. But I still think transcendence is not something that it's not something that is means we transcend out of something, but we transcend back, and we're connecting the beginning with the end, and therefore we include the difference, the experience of difference, that the experience of knowledge, the experience of experience into our enclosed and then at the same time reopen self understanding, growing self-understanding. Of course, one self-evidence, like Holderlin expressed it in the poem I was quoting, is not a singular moment. It has to be made permanent. It has to be made permanent, and it can be made permanent, I think, more or less. Depends maybe how conscious we become of it, and how much effort we put into it, right? And this is what the traditions share. I think the highest high ground of philosophies in ancient China, East Asia, and ancient India, and ancient Western Asian, Central Asian context, in the Occidental realm, but also in the ancient traditions, even in Meso and South America, I guess, there have been these understandings, which all turn which all point into that direction. At least I think we can find the traces. Also, we can find traces in the old texts of many civilizations, but we have to reignite or rejuvenate this understanding in our time, and I think this is also why I think today, and this circle here is also a wonderful opportunity to raise the awareness for this topic and for poetry. And I'm very, very thankful again for Ray's and for Professor Giri and Raffles University that you have provided me with this great opportunity to speak, and also all the questions. Thank you very much. I couldn't answer all of them. Sorry. Next time we'll participate in a discussion again, and maybe we can.
Thank you, David. And we might take a few more minutes because you have to also attend to your young son. So,
yes. So I have to leave you here because already very late. But please go on. Don't stop here. It's a very, very interesting discussion. I would love to stay, and I'm looking very much forward to the next occasion. So thank you again. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Thank you, Dr. David.
Thank you very much. Has been a great pleasure. Has been great fun. And please,
Thank you.
I wish you,
Thank you, Dr. David.
Thank you.
And thank you. And I
all
saw
the best, dear friends. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All the best.
We'll
Bye-bye.
meet.
Thank you.
And in the chat box, we saw a note from Zahra, who is from Afghanistan. And maybe it would be lovely to hear her for a moment. Zahra, would you like to share your thought? Zahra?
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Hello,
Yes,
everyone.
Yes, would you like to share your thoughts? Yes.
Actually, my internet connection was not good in the beginning. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
But as far as I understood, and also my English is not perfect, I could not understand everything perfectly. But as far as I understood, I had a very, I didn't have a very big idea of the poetry, especially English poetry, poetry in India and other places. But in this webinar, I have learned a lot of things. I have learned how important literature and poetry is, and everything I learned, I cannot describe it. Thank you very much. It was such a very big pleasure for me to join this webinar and learned a lot.
And where are you based, Zahra? Where are you now?
I'm right now in Afghanistan.
Oh, Afghanistan. So, salam alaikum.
Yes.
And
thank you.
And maybe you would like to tell one or two lines of Afghan poetry in Pashto or Dari.
Of course, maybe in maybe in the future I may
now
present something. Right now I don't remember anything.
Or you can just sing an Afghan song, maybe one or two lines of Afghan song.
Right now I cannot.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. And also I am a I am a literature student in an Indian university, but unfortunately, since I have submitted, I have received this scholarship, everything went to lockdown, and it is becoming my dream to go to India once.
Thank you. And also very quickly, Randhir, you will see another question in the chat box. Just have a look. I think one Nicola on Heidegger and technology. Do you see that?
Yes, yes. What is the connection between Holderlin's poetry on Rahim and Heidegger's take on technology?
And let us hear Joharel. Joharel, we request you to share your thought very quickly. Okay, he's not coming. So then, of course, this is a very interesting question. And the point is that how Holderlin in the poem makes a distinction between the kind of bridge and how the wooden bridge makes a connection between the two sides, and how the other kind of bridge does not give that connection. So that is a source for critique of technology. So now we would move along. Very quickly, Minati has been present. Would you like to share some thought, Minati? Okay, she is coming. And I think there were some questions to Asadi. Asadi was trying to clarify her position. So it would be nice to listen to her very, very briefly. Asadi, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify actually what Professor Meera Chakravarti has said, that it was factually perhaps incorrect. but actually I was talking in the context of Indian rasa theory, and which is actually developed by Abhinav Gupta. And in that context, I was saying, which is written in the around 4th or 5th century, if I'm correct, if I'm not wrong. So that is what I was saying, that in that ancient kind of times, I'm not saying that there was no poetry. Surely there was poetry. But in Rasa theory, the discussion on the aesthetic experience and the aesthetic enjoyment actually is centered around play and not poetry. That was the issue I was raising. And this is an interesting issue in the sense that if you look at as a comparative study, because in the ancient Greek tradition, it's the tragedy and also the poetry, which is actually the focus of the discussion. Painting comes later on. This representation theory, expression theory, and everything that comes a little later. But if you go back to the ancient times, it's basically the poetry which has been discussed so much in Greek, Indian, Western tradition. But in Indian tradition, as I was saying, this was in the Rasa theory. It is basically the play, which, as if all other forms of arts are reducible to play. That's a kind of presupposition with which Bharat is actually working with, and this is objectionable. Of course, I mean, like my teacher himself, Professor Dayakrishna, has raised an issue on that, saying that it is like an adhyasa with which the rasa theory has been living even today in the literature, and it's like over emphasis on rasa theory, which is giving so much prominence to play other than other forms of the arts. That's the point I was saying. That yeah, I didn't elaborate, so that might have created misunderstanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Asadi. And now we come to Randhir, and
Yes.
and
Thank you.
very quickly, Randhir and our friend also putting your thought and thanks together.
Yes, yes. I think, Asa ma'am talking about self-giving. So she mentioned one of the important thinker, very famous poet, Rabindranath Tagore. But since I am a follower of philosophy of Iqbal, so he is also talking about selflessness. And I'm also having same connotation I found in Aparigraha, philosophy of Aparigraha of Gandhi and Buddha. So, but since, the question is not the separation between philosophy and poetry, I have also mentioned in my introduction, I think it's my understanding, philosophy has always had two broad goals, if you see, which might be called one truth and another edification. The formal goal is shared with science and mathematics. The latter goal is shared by poetry and religion. Philosophical practitioners are therapists, I would say, who use the edifying aspects of philosophy. And I think the author, Elit Cohen, may have a point here. If someone is suffering, if a state or society for that matter is suffering, edifying philosophy is more likely to help. If there is a sympathetic mess with pre-existing belief, I doubt that radical challenge to pre-existing belief will be helpful to a suffering person unless he or she at some level already wants to give them up. So the question is of self. And yesterday I was preparing for my talk and my understanding on poetry. I was reading very important book of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who died in February, and he wrote Poetry as Insurgent Art. And there he talked about think subjectively, write objectively. And he also said very important, like poetry in itself, like love delights in love, joy delights in joy, poetry delights in poetry. So poetry in the sense of ideas before, they are distilled into the thought. So it was very interesting, talk, not only from the point of view of the speaker, but Professor Asha Mukherjee and John Clammer, also, and Professor Ananta Giri, gave a very insightful talk and enriched the whole philosophical curiosity of the webinar, for that matter. Thank you so much, sir. And since we are running out of the time, if we have the constraint of time, then
thank you, Randhir, and you are really an embodiment of creative self-transcendence. and bringing aparigraha and self-giving together, which reminds me of this poem from Kabir, and bringing Iqbal and another kind of journey that we need to make now. And then Mana Yaro Laga Fakiri le.
Mana Yaro
Laga Fakir le. So I think that sense of fakir and what Ashaji was saying, that we have to leave our home and at that moment, and Tagore embodied that. So let us, I'm grateful to all of you for our journey together. And next Sunday, we also have a very beautiful gift for us. Professor Ori Soltes will speak to us or speak with us about Martin Buber, and our friend Daniel Rave, whom many of us know, will join, and also Professor John Clammer will join in this dialogue on Buber and our contemporary world. So we look forward.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. It has been a pleasure. Yeah.
Yes, and Jara,
Thank you.
and Jara from Afghanistan, we are so happy that you have joined us. Our solidarity and prayer with Afghanistan at this moment. So you please leave your email and contact details with us. We would like to, please put your email in the chat box if it is all right. We will invite you to our dialogue.
Yes.
Wonderful to see John and Miradi and everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.